The Parlor Car Ghost. All draped with blue denim, the seaside cottage of my friend Sarah Pine. She asked me to go there with her when she opened to have it set in order for the summer. She confessed she felt a trifle nervous at the idea of entering it alone. And I'm always ready for an excursion. So much blue denim rather surprised me, because blue is not complimentary to Sarah's complexion. She always wears some shade of red by preference. She perceived my wonder. She is very near-sighted and therefore sees everything by some sort of sixth sense. "You do not like my portieres and curtains and table covers," she said. "Neither do I, but I did it to accommodate. And now he rests well in his grave, I hope." "Whose grave, for pity's sake?" "Mr. J. Billington Price's." "And who is he? He doesn't sound interesting." "Then I will tell you about him," said Sarah, taking a seat directly in front of one of those curtains. "Last autumn I was leaving this place for New York, travelling on the fast express train known as the Flying Yankee. Of course, I thought of the Flying Dutchman and Wagner's musical setting of the uncanny legend, and how different things are in these days of steam, etc. Then I looked out of the window at the landscape, the horizon that seemed to wheel in a great curve as the train sped on. Every now and then I had an impression at the tail of the eye that a man was sitting in a chair 3 or 4 numbers in front of me on the opposite side of the car. Each time that I saw this shape I looked at the chair and ascertained that it was unoccupied. But it was an odd trick of vision. I raised my lorgnette, and the chair showed emptier than before. There was nobody in it, certainly. But the more I knew that it was vacant, the more plainly I saw the man. Always with the corner of my eye. It made me nervous. When passengers entered the car I dreaded lest they might take that seat. What would happen if they should? A bag was put in the chair. That made me uncomfortable. The bag was removed at the next station. Then a baby was placed in the seat. It began to laugh as though someone had gently tickled it. There was something odd about that chair. 13 was its number. When I looked away from it the impression was strong upon me that some person sitting there was watching me. Really, it would not do to humour such fancies. So I touched the electric button, asked the porter to bring me a table, and taking from my bag a pack of cards, proceeded to divert myself with a game of patience. I was puzzling where to put a 7 of spades. "Where can it go?" I murmured to myself. A voice behind me prompted, "Play the 4 of diamonds on the 5, and you can do it." I started. The only occupants of the car besides me were a bridal couple, a mother with 3 little children, and a typical preacher of one of the straightest sects. Who had spoken? "Play up the 4, madam," repeated this voice. I looked fearfully over my shoulder. At first I saw a bluish cloud, like cigar smoke, but inodorous. Then the vision cleared, and I saw a young man whom I knew by a subtle intuition to be the occupant, seen and not seen, of chair number 13. Evidently he was a travelling salesman, and a ghost. Of course, a drummer's ghost sounds ridiculous, they're so extremely alive. Or else you would expect a dead drummer to be particularly dead and not walk. This was a most commonplace looking ghost, cordial, pushing, businesslike. At the same time his face had an expression of utter despair and horror, which made him still more preposterous. Of course it is not nice to let a stranger speak to one, even on so impersonal a topic as a 4 of diamonds. But a ghost! There can't be any rule of etiquette about talking with a ghost. My dear, it was dreadful. That forward creature showed me how to play all the cards, and then begged me to lay them out again, in order that he might give me some clever points. I was too much amazed and disturbed to speak. I could only place the cards at his suggestion. This I did so as not to appear to be listening to the empty air, and be supposed to be a crazy woman. Presently the ghost spoke again, and told me his story. "Madam," he said, "I have been riding back and forth on this car ever since February 22, 1890. 7 months and 11 days. All this time I have not exchanged a word with any one. For a drummer, it's pretty hard, you may believe. You know the story of the Flying Dutchman? Well, that is very nearly my case. A curse is upon me and will not be removed until some kind soul. But I'm getting ahead of my text. That day there were 4 of us, travelling for different houses. One of the boys was in wool, one in baking powder, one in boots and shoes, and myself in cotton goods. We met on the road, took seats together and fell into talking shop. Those fellows told big lies about their sales, Washington's birthday though it was. The baking powder man raised the amount of the bills of goods which he had sold better than a whole can of his stuff could have done. I admitted the straight truth, that I had not yet been able to make a sale. And then I swore, not in a light-minded, chipper style of verbal trimmings, but a great, round, heaven-defying oath, that I would sell a case of blue denim on that trip if it took me forever. We became dry with talk, and when the train stopped at Rivermouth, we went out to have some beer. It is good there, you know. Pardon me. I forgot I was speaking to a lady. Well, we had to run to get aboard. I missed my footing, fell under the wheels, and the next thing I knew they were holding an inquest over my remains, while I, disembowelled, was sitting in a corner of the undertaker's table, wondering which of the coroner's jury was likely to want a case of blue denims. Then I remembered my wicked oath, and understood that I was a soul doomed to wander until I could succeed in selling that bill of goods. I spoke once or twice, offering the denims under value, but nobody noticed me. Verdict: accidental death, negligence of deceased, railroad corporation not to blame. Deceased got out for beer at his own risk. The other drummers took charge of the remains, and wrote a beautiful letter to my relatives about my social qualities and my impressive conversation. I wish it had been less impressive at that time. I might have lied about my sales, or I might have said that I hoped for better luck. But after that oath there was nothing for it. Back and forth on this road, in chair number 13, to all eternity. Nobody suspects my presence. They sit on my knees. I'm playing in luck when it is a nice baby as it was this afternoon. They pile wraps, bags, even railway literature on me. They play cards under my nose, and what duffers some of them are! You, madam, are the first person who has perceived me, and therefore I venture to speak to you, meaning no offence. I can see that you are sorry for me. Now, if you recall the story of the Flying Dutchman, he was saved by the charity of a good woman. In fact, Senta married him. Now I'm not asking anything of that size. I see that you wear a wedding ring, and no doubt you make some man's happiness. I wasn't a marrying man myself, and naturally I'm not a marrying ghost. And that has nothing to do with the matter anyway. But if you could, I don't suppose you would have any use for them, but if you were disposed to do a good turn, solid Christian charity, I should be everlastingly grateful, and you may have that case of denim at $72.50. And that quality is quoted today at $80. Does it go, madam?" The speech of the poor ghost was not very eloquent, but his eyes had an intense, eager glare, which was terrible. Something, pity, fear, I do not know what, compelled me. I decided to do without that white and gold evening cloak. Instead, I gave $72.50 to the ghost and took from him a receipt for the sum, signed J. Billington Price. Then he smiled contentedly, thanked me with emotion, and returned to chair number 13. Several times on the journey, although I did not perceive him again, I felt dazed. When the train arrived at New York, and I, with the other passengers, dismounted, it seemed to me that a strong hand passed under my elbow, steadying me down the steps. As I walked the length of the station, my bag, not heavy at any time, appeared to become weightless. I believe that the parlour car ghost walked beside me, carrying the bag, whose handle still remained in my other hand. Indeed, once or twice I thought I felt the touch of cold fingers against mine. Since then I have no reason to suppose that the poor ghost is not at rest. I hope he is. But I never expected nor wished for the blue denims. The next day, however, a dray belonging to a great wholesale house backed up to our door and delivered a case of denims, with a receipted bill for the same. What was I to do? I could not go about selling blue denims. I could not give them away without exciting comment. So I furnished the cottage with them, and you know the effect on my complexion. Pity me, dear, and credit me, frivolous woman as I am, with having saved a soul at the expense of my own vanity. My story is told. What do you think about it? The Burglar's Ghost. I'm not an imaginative man, and no one who knows me can say I have ever indulged in sentimental ideas upon any subject. I am rather predisposed, in fact, to look at everything from a purely practical standpoint, and this quality has been further developed in me by the fact that for 20 years I have been an active member of the detective police force at Westford, a large town in one of our most important manufacturing districts. A policeman, as most people will readily believe, has to deal with so much practical life that he has small opportunity for developing other than practical qualities, and he is more apt to believe in tangible things than in ideas of somewhat superstitious nature. However, I was once under the firm conviction that I had been largely helped up the ladder of life by the ghost of a once well-known burglar. I have told the story to many, and have heard it commented upon in various fashions. Whether the comments were satirical or practical, it made no difference to me. I had a firm faith at that time in the truth of my tale. 18 years ago I was a plain-clothes officer at Westford. I was then 23 years of age, and very anxious about two matters. First and foremost I desired promotion. Second, I wished to be married. Of course I was more eager about the second than the first, because my sweetheart, Alice Moore, was one of the prettiest and cleverest girls in the town. But I put promotion first for the simple reason that with me promotion must come before marriage. Knowing this, I was always on the lookout for a chance of distinguishing myself, and I paid much attention to my duties that my superiors began to notice me, and foretold a successful career for me in the future. One evening in the last week of September, 1873, I was sitting in my lodgings wondering what I could do to earn the promotion which I so earnestly wished for. Things were quiet just then in Westford, and I am afraid I half wished that something dreadful might occur, if I only could have a share in it. I was pursuing this train of thought when suddenly I heard a voice say, "Good evening, officer." I turned sharply around. It was almost dusk and my lamp was not lighted. For all that, I could see clearly enough a man who was sitting by a chest of drawers that stood between the door and the window. His chair stood between the drawers and the door, and I concluded that he had quietly entered my room and seated himself before addressing me. "Good evening," I replied. "I didn't hear you come in." He laughed when I said that, a low chuckling, rather sly laugh. "No," he said, "I dare say not, officer. I'm a very quiet sort of person. You might say, in fact, noiseless. Just so." I looked at him narrowly, feeling considerably surprised and astonished at his presence. He was a thickly built man with a square face and heavy chin. His nose was small, but aggressive. His eyes were little and overshadowed by heavy eyebrows. I could see them twinkle when he spoke. As for his dress, it was in keeping with his face. He wore a rough suit of woolen or frieze. A thick, gaily coloured belcher neckerchief encircled his bow-like throat, and in his big hands he continually twirled and twisted a fur cap, made apparently out of the skin of some favourite dog. As he sat there smiling at me, and saying nothing, It made me feel uncomfortable. "What do you want with me?" I asked. "Just a little matter of business," he answered. "You should have gone to the office," I said. "We're not supposed to do business at home." "Right you are, Governor," he replied, "but I wanted to see you. It is you that's got to do my job. If I seen the superintendent he might 'a' put somebody else on it. That wouldn't 'a' suited me. You see, officer, you're young, and naturally eager for promotion, eh?" "What is it you want?" I inquired again. "Ain't you eager to be promoted?" he reiterated. "Ain't you now, officer?" I saw no reason why I should conceal the fact, even from this strange visitor. I admitted that I was eager for promotion. "Ah," he said, with a satisfied smile, "I'm glad of that. It'll make you all the keener. Now, officer, you listen to me. I'm a goin' to put you on to a nice little job. I daresay you'll be a sergeant before long, you will. You'll be complimented and praised for your clever conduct in this 'ere affair. Mark my words if you ain't." "Out with it," I said, fancying I saw through the man's meaning. "You're going to split on some of your pals, I suppose, and you want a reward." He shook his head. "A reward," he said, "wouldn't be no use to me at all. No, not if it was £1,000. No, it ain't nothing to do with reward. But now, officer, did you ever hear of a light-toed Jim?" Light-toed Jim! I should have been a poor detective if I had not. Why, the man under that sobriquet was one of the cleverest burglars and thieves in England, and had enjoyed such a famous career that his name was a household word. At that moment there was an additional interest attached to him. He had been convicted of burglary at the Northminster Assizes in 1871, and sentenced to 10 years' penal servitude. After serving nearly 2 years of his time he escaped from Portland, getting away in such clever fashion that he had never been heard of since. Where he was no one could say, but lately there had been a strong suspicion among the police that Light-toed Jim was at his old tricks again. "Light-toed Jim?" I repeated. "I should think so. Why, what do you know about him?" He smiled and nodded his head. "Light-toed Jim," said he, "is in Westford at this 'ere identical moment. Listen to me, officer. Light-toed Jim is a goin' to crack a crib to night. Said crib is the mansion of Miss Singleton, that 'ere rich old lady as lives out on Mapleton Road. You know her. Awfully rich, with naught but women servants and animals about the place. There's some very valuable plate there. That's what Light-toed Jim's after. He'll get in through the scullery window about 1 a.m., then he'll pass through the back and front kitchens and into the butler's pantry, only it's a butleress, 'cause there ain't no men at all, and there he'll set to work on the safe. Some of his late pals in Portland gave him the tip about this 'ere job." "How did you come to hear of it?" I asked. "Never mind, Governor. You wouldn't understand. Now, I want you to be up there to night to nab Light-toed Jim red-handed, so to speak. It'll mean promotion for you, and it'll suit me down to the ground. You wants to be about and to watch him enter, then follow him and dog him. And he be armed, officer, for Jim'll fight like a tiger if you don't draw his teeth first." "Now look here, my man," said I, "this is all very well, but it's all irregular. You must tell me who you are and how you come to be in Light-toed Jim's secrets, and I'll put it down in black and white." I turned away from him to get my writing materials. I was not half a minute with my back to him, but when I turned around he was gone. The door was shut, but I had heard no sound from it either opening or shutting. Quick as I thought I darted to it, tore it wide open, and looked down the narrow staircase. There was no one there. I ran hastily downstairs into the passage, and found my landlady, Mrs. Mariner, standing at the open door with a female friend. "Mrs. Mariner," I said, breaking in upon their conversation, "which way did that man go who came downstairs just now?" Mrs. Mariner looked at me strangely. "There ain't been no man come downstairs, Mr. Parker," said she. "Leastways not this good 3/4 of an hour, which me and Mrs. Higgins 'ere as have come out to take an airing. Her having been ironin' all this blessed day, has been standin' 'ere all the time and ain't never seen a soul." "Nonsense," I said. "A man came down from my room just now, the man you sent up 20 minutes since." Mrs. Marriner looked at me with an expression betokening the most profound astonishment. Mrs. Higgins sighed deeply. "Mr. Parker," said Mrs. Marriner, "I'm sorry to say it, sir, but you're either intoxicated or else you're a sickening for brain fever, sir. There ain't no person entered this door, in or out, for nigh on to an hour, as me and Mrs. Higgins 'ere will take our Bible oaths on." I went upstairs and looked in the rooms on either side of mine. The man was not there. I looked under my bed, and of course he was not there. He must have gone downstairs. But then the women must have seen him. There was only one door to the house. I gave it up in despair and began to smoke my pipe. By the time I had drawn the last whiff I decided that if any one was intoxicated it was probably Mrs. Marriner and Mrs. Higgins, and that my strange visitor had departed by the door. I was not going to believe that he had anything supernatural about him. I had no duty that night, and as the hours wore on I found myself stern in my resolve to go up to Mrs. Singleton's house and see what I could make out of my informant's story. It was my opinion that my late visitor was a whilom pal of Light-toed Jim, and that having become aware of the latter's plot, he had, for some reason of his own, decided to split on his old chum. Thieves' disagreement is an honest man's opportunity, and I determined to solve the truth of the story told me. Lest it should come to nothing, I decided not to report the matter to my chief. If I could really capture Light-toed Jim, my success would be all the more brilliant by being suddenly sprung upon the authorities. I made my plan of action rapidly. I took a revolver with me and went up to Mrs. Singleton's house. Fortunately, I knew the housekeeper there, a middle-aged, strong-minded woman, not easily frightened, which was a good thing. To her I communicated such information as I considered necessary. She consented to conceal me in the room where the safe stood. There was a cupboard close by the safe from which I could command a full view of the burglar's operations and pounce upon him at the right moment. If only my information was to be relied upon, there was every chance of my capturing the famous burglar. Soon after midnight, when the house was all quiet, I went to the pantry and got into the cupboard, locking myself in. There were 2 openings in the panel, through which of either I was able to command a full view of the room. My position was somewhat cramped, but the time soon passed away. My mind was principally occupied in wondering if I was really about to have a chance of distinguishing myself. Somehow there was an air of unreality about the events of the evening which puzzled me. Suddenly I heard a sound which put me on the alert at once. It was nothing more than the creaking of a board or opening of a door would make in a quiet house, but it sounded intensified to my expectant ears. I drew myself up against the door of the cupboard, and placed my eye to the opening of the panel. I had oiled the key of the door, and kept my fingers upon it in readiness to spring upon the burglar at the proper moment. After what seemed some time, I saw the gleam of light through the keyhole of the door opening into the pantry. Then it opened, and a man carrying a small lantern came gently into the room. At first I could see nothing of his face, but when my eyes grew accustomed to the hazy light, I saw that I had been rightly informed, and that the burglar was indeed no other than the famous Light-toed Jim. As I stood there watching him, I could not help admiring the cool fashion in which he went to work. He went over to the window and examined it. He tried the door of the cupboard in which I stood concealed. Then he locked the door of the pantry and turned his attention to the safe. He set his lamp on a chair before the lock and took from his pocket as neat and pretty a collection of tools as I ever saw. With these he went quietly and swiftly to work. Light-toed Jim was a somewhat slimly built fellow, with little muscular development about him, while I'm a big man with plenty of bone and sinew. If matters had come to a fight between us, I could have done what I pleased with him, but I knew that Jim would not chance a fight. Somewhere about him I felt sure there was a revolver, which he would use on the least provocation. My plan, therefore, was to wait until his back was bent over the lock of the safe, then to open the cupboard door noiselessly, and fall bodily upon him, pinning him to the ground beneath me. Before long the moment came. He was working away steadily at the lock, his whole attention concentrated on the job. The slight noise of his drill was sufficient to drown the faint click of the key in the cupboard door. I turned it quickly and tumbled right upon him, driving the tool out of his hands and tumbling him into a heap at the front of the safe. He uttered an exclamation of rage and astonishment as he went down, and immediately began to wriggle under me like an eel. As I kept him down with one hand, I tried to pull out the handcuffs with the other. This somewhat embarrassed me, and the burglar profited by it to pull out a sharp knife. He had worked himself around on his back, and before I realized what he was after, he was hacking furiously at me with his keen, dagger-like blade. Then I realized that we were going to have a fight for it, and prepared myself. He tried to run the knife into my side. I warded it off, but the blade caught the fleshy part of my left arm, and I felt a warm stream of blood spurt out. That maddened me, and I seized one of the steel drills laying near at hand, and hit my man with such a blow over the temple that he collapsed at once, and lay as if dead. I put the handcuffs on him instantly, and, to make matters still more certain, I secured his ankles. Then I rose and looked at my arm. The knife had made a nasty gash, and the blood was flowing freely, but it was not serious, and when the housekeeper, who had just then appeared on the scene, had bandaged it, I went out and secured the help of the first policeman I met in conveying Light-Toed Jim to the office. I felt a proud man when I made my report to the inspector. "Light-Toed Jim," said he. "What, James Bland? Nonsense, Parker." But I took him to the cells where Jim was being attended to by the doctor. "You're right, Parker," he said. "That's the man. Well, this'll be a fine thing for you." After a time, feeling a little exhausted, I went home to try and get some sleep. The surgeon had attended to my arm, and told me it was but a superficial wound. It felt sore in spite of that. I had no sooner reached my lodgings than I saw sitting in my easy-chair the strange man who had called upon me earlier in the evening. He rose to his feet when I entered. I stared at him in utter astonishment. "Well, Governor," said he, "I see you've done it. You've got him square and fair, I reckon." "Yes," I said. "Ah," he said, with a sigh of complete satisfaction, "then I'm satisfied. Yes, I don't know as how there's aught more I could say. I reckon that's how Light-Toed Jim and me's quits." I was determined to find out who this man was this time. "Sit down," I said. "There's a question or two I must ask you. Just let me get my coat off and I'll talk to you." I took my coat off and went over to the bed to lay it down. "Now then," I began, and looked around at him. I said no more, being literally dumbstruck. The man was gone. I began to feel uncomfortable. I ran hastily downstairs, only to find the outer door locked and bolted, as I had left it a few minutes before. I went back, utterly nonplussed. For an hour I pondered the matter over, but could neither make head nor tail of it. When I went down to the office next morning, I was informed that the burglar wanted to see me. I went to his cell, where he was lying in bed with his head bandaged. I had hit him pretty hard, as it turned out, and it was probable he would have to lie on the sick list for some days. "Well, Governor," said he, "you'd the best of me last night. You hit me rather hard that time." "I was sorry to have to do it, my man," I answered. "You would have stabbed me if you could." "Yes," he said, "I should. But I say, Governor, come a bit closer. I want to ask you a question. How did you know I was on that little job last night? For s'help me, there wasn't a soul knew a breath about it but myself. I hadn't no pals, never talked to nobody about it, never thought aloud about it, as I knows on. How came you to spot it, governor?" There was no one else in the cell with us, and I thought I might find out something about my mysterious visitor of the night before. "It was a pal of yours who gave me the information," I said. "Can't be, governor. No use tellin' me that. I ain't got no pals, leastways not in this job. Did you ever know a man like this?" I described my visitor. As I proceeded, Light toed Jim's face assumed an expression of real terror. Whatever colour was in it faded away. I never saw a man look more thoroughly frightened. "Yes, yes," he said eagerly, "in course I know who it is. Why, that's Barksey Bill, as I'd pal with at one time. And what did he say, governor? That he owed me a grudge? That we was quits at last?" "Right you are, 'cause he did owe me a grudge. I treated Bill very shabby indeed, and he swore solemn he'd have his revenge on ye, governor. What you see wasn't Barksey Bill at all, but his ghost, 'cause Barksey Bill's been dead and buried this 3 year." I was naturally very much exercised in my mind over this weird development of the affair, and I used to think about it long after Light toed Jim had once more retired into the seclusion of Portland. While he was in charge at Westford, I tried more than once to worm some more information out of him about the defunct Barksey Bill, but with no success. He would say no more than that Bill was dead and buried this 3 year, and with that I had to be content. Gradually I came to have a firm belief that I had indeed been visited by Barksey Bill's ghost, and I often told the story to brother officers, and sometimes got well laughed at. That, however, mattered little to me. I felt sure that any man who had gone through the same experience would have had the same beliefs. Of course I got my promotion and was soon afterward married. Things went well with me, and I was lifted from one step to another. In my secret mind I was always sure I owed my first rise to the burglar's ghost, and I should have continued to think so but for an incident which occurred just 5 years after my capture of Light toed Jim. I had occasion to travel to Sheffield from Westford, and had to change trains at Leeds. The carriage I stepped into was occupied by a solitary individual, who turned his face to me as I sat down. Though dressed in more respectable fashion, I immediately recognised the man who had visited me so mysteriously at my lodgings. My first feeling was one of fear, and I dare say my face showed it, for the man laughed. "Hullo, governor," said he, "I see you knew me as soon as you come in. You owes a deal to me, governor, now don't ye, eh?" "Look here, my man," I said, "I've been taking you for a ghost these 5 years past. Now just tell me how you got in and out of my room that night, will you?" He laughed long and loud at that. "A ghost," said he. "Well, if that ain't a good urn. Why, easy enough, governor. I was a lodging for a day or two in the same house. It was easy enough, when you know how, to open a door very quiet and slip out, too. But I followed you sharp, and looked for you." "Ay, governor, but you looked down, and I'd gone up." "You should 'a' come up to the attics, and there you'd 'a' found me." "So you took me for a ghost. Well, I'm blowed." I told him what Light toed Jim had said in the cell. "Ay," said he, "I dare say, governor. You see 'twas this way. It weren't Jim's fault I wasn't dead. He tried to murder me, governor, he did, and left me a lyin' for dead. So I says to myself when I comes round that I'd pay him out sooner or later. But after that I quit the profession, Jim's nasty conduct having made me sick of it. So I went in for honest work at my old trade, which was draining and pipe repairing. I was on a job of that sort in Westford, near Miss Singleton's house, when I seed Light toed Jim. I had a idea what he was up to, having heard of the plate, and I watches him one or two nights, and gets a notion how he was going to work the job. Then, o' course, you being an officer and close at hand, I splits on him, and that's all." "But you had got the time and details correct." "Oh, why, of course, Governor. I was an old hand, served many years at Portland, I have, and I knew just how Jim would work it, after seeing his preliminary observations. But a ghost! Ha, ha, ha! Why, Governor, you must have been a very green young officer in them days." "Perhaps I was. At any rate I learned a lesson from the ci devant Barksey Bill, namely, that in searching a house it is always advisable to look up as well as down." A PHANTOM TOE. I'm not a superstitious man, far from it; but despite all my efforts to the contrary, I could not help thinking, directly I had taken a survey of my chamber, that I should never quit it without going through a strange adventure. There was something in its immense size, heaviness and gloom that seemed to annihilate at one blow all my resolute scepticism as regards supernatural visitations. It appeared to me totally impossible to go into that room and disbelieve in ghosts. The fact is, I had incautiously partaken at supper of that favourite Dutch dish, sauerkraut, and I suppose it had disagreed with me, and put strange fancies into my head. But this be as it may, I only know that after parting with my friend for the night, I gradually worked myself up into such a state of fidgetness that at last I wasn't sure whether I had become a ghost myself. Supposing, ruminated I, supposing the landlord himself should be a practical robber, and should have taken the lock and bolt from off this door for the purpose of entering here in the dead of night, abstracting all my property, and perhaps murdering me. I thought the dog had a very cut-throat air about him. Now, I had never had any such idea until that moment, for my host was a fat all Dutchmen are fat stupid looking fellow, who I don't believe had sense enough to understand what a robbery or murder meant. But somehow or other, whenever we have anything really to annoy us, and certainly it was not pleasant to go to bed in a strange place without being able to fasten one's door, we are sure to aggravate it by myriads of chimeras of our own brain. So on the present occasion, in the midst of 1,000 disagreeable reveries, some of the most wild absurdity, I jumped very gloomily into bed, having first put out my candle, for total darkness is far preferable to its flickering, ghostly light, which transformed rather than revealed objects, and soon fell asleep, perfectly tired out with my day's writing. How long I lay asleep I don't know, but I suddenly awoke from a disagreeable dream of cutthroats, ghosts, and long winding passages in a haunted inn. An indescribable feeling such as I never before experienced hung upon me. It seemed as if every nerve in my body had 100 spirits tickling it, and this was accompanied by so great a heat that inwardly, cursing mine's host sauerkraut and wondering how the Dutchman could endure such a poison, I was forced to sit up in bed to cool myself. The whole of the room was profoundly dark, excepting at one place, where the moonlight, falling through a crevice in the shutters, threw a straight line about an inch or so thick upon the floor, clear, sharp, and intensely brilliant against the darkness. I leave you to conceive my horror when, upon looking at this said line of light, I saw there a naked human toe, nothing more. For the first instant I thought the vision must be some effect of moonlight, then that I was only half awake and could not distinctly see. So I rubbed my eyes 2 or 3 times and looked again. Still there was the accursed thing, plain, distinct, immovable, marble-like in its fixedness and rigidity, but in everything else horribly human. I am not an easily frightened man. No one who has travelled so much and seen so much has been exposed to so many dangers as I can be, but there was something so mysterious and unusual in the appearance of this single toe, that for a short time I could not think what to be at, so I did nothing but stare at it in a state of utter bewilderment. At length, however, as the toe did not vanish under my steady gaze, I thought I might as well change my tactics, and remembering that all midnight invaders, be they thieves, ghosts, or devils, dislike nothing so much as a good noise, I shouted out in a loud voice, "Who's there?" The toe immediately disappeared in the darkness. Almost simultaneously with my words I leapt out of bed, and rushed towards the place where I had beheld the strange appearance. The next instant I ran against something and felt an iron grip round my body. After this I have no distinct recollection of what occurred, excepting that a fearful struggle ensued between me and my unseen opponent; that every now and then we were violently hurled to the floor, from which we always rose again in an instant, locked in a deadly embrace; that we tugged and strained and pulled and pushed, I in the convulsive and frantic energy of a fight for life, he, for by this time I had discovered that the intruder was a human being, actuated by some passion of which I was ignorant; that we whirled round and round, cheek to cheek and arm to arm, in fierce contest, till the room appeared to whiz round us, and that at least a dozen people, my fellow traveller among them, roused, I suppose, by our repeated falls, came pouring into the room with lights and showed me struggling with a man having nothing on but a shirt, whose long tangled hair and wild, unsettled eyes told me he was insane. And then, for the first time, I became aware that I had received in the conflict several gashes from a knife, which my opponent still held in his hand. To conclude my story in a few words, for I dare say all of you by this time are getting very tired, it turned out that my midnight visitor was a madman who was being conveyed to a lunatic asylum at the Hague, and that he and his keeper had been obliged to stop at Delft on their way. The poor fellow had contrived during the night to escape from his keeper, who had carelessly forgotten to lock the door of his chamber, and with that irresistible desire to shed blood particular to so many insane people had possessed himself of a pocket knife belonging to the man who had charge of him, entered my room, which was most likely the only one in the house, unfastened, and was probably meditating the fatal stroke when I saw his toe in the moonlight, the rest of his body being hidden in the shade. After this terrible freak of his he was watched with much greater strictness; but I ought to observe, as some excuse for the keeper's negligence, that this was the first act of violence he had ever attempted. The Phantom Woman. He took an all-possessing, burning fancy to her from the first. She was neither young nor pretty, so far as he could see, but she was wrapped round with mystery. That was the key of it all. She was noticeable in spite of herself. Her face at the window, sunset after sunset, her eyes, gazing out mournfully through the dusty panes, hypnotized the lawyer. He saw her through the twilight, night after night, and he grew at length to wait through the days in a feverish waiting for dusk, and that one look at an unknown woman. She was always at the same window on the ground floor, sitting doing nothing. She looked beyond, so the infatuated solicitor fancied, at him. Once he even thought that he detected the ghost of a friendly smile on her lips. Their eyes always met with a mute desire to make acquaintance. This romance went on for a couple of months. Gilbert Dent assured himself that nothing in his life can possibly remain stationary, and he cudgelled his brain for a respectable manner of introducing himself to his idol. He had hardly arrived at this point when he received a shock. There came an evening when she was not at the window. Next morning he walked down Wood Lane on his way to the office. He always went by train, but he felt a strong disinclination to go through another day without a sight of her. His heart began to beat like a schoolgirl's as he drew near the house. If she should be at the window! He was almost disposed to take his courage in his hand and call on her, and yes, even tell her in quick bursts that she had mysteriously become all the world to him. He could see nothing ridiculous in this course. The possibility of her being married, or having family ties of any sort, had simply never occurred to him. However, she was not at the window. What was more, there was a sinister silence, a sort of breathlessness about the whole place. It was a very hot morning in late August. He looked a long time, but no face came, and no movement stirred in the house. He went his way, walking like a man who has been heavily knocked on the brow and sees stars still. That afternoon he left the office early, and in less than an hour stood at the gate again. The window was blank. He pushed the gate back, it hung on one hinge, and walked up the drive to the door. There were 5 steps leading up to it. At the foot he wheeled aside sharply to the window. He had a sick dread of looking through the small panes, why he could not have told. When at last he found courage to look he saw there was a small round table set just under the window, a work table to all appearance. One of those things with lots of little compartments all round and a lid in the middle which shut over a well-like cavity for holding pieces of needlework. He remembered that his mother had one, 30 years before. Round the edge of the table was gripped a small, delicate hand. Gilbert Dent's eyes ran from this bloodless hand and slim wrist to a shoulder under a coarse stuff bodice, to a rather wasted throat, which was bare and flung back. So this was the end, before the beginning. He saw her. She was dead, twisted on the floor with a ghastly face turned up toward the ceiling, and stiff fingers caught in desperation round the work table. He stumbled away along the path and into the lane. For a long time he could not realize the horror of this thing. The influence of the decayed house hung over him. Nothing seemed real. It was quite dark when he moved away from the gate, and went in the direction of the nearest police station. That she was dead, this woman whose very name he did not know, although she influenced him so powerfully, he was certain. One look at the face would have told anyone that. That she was murdered he more than suspected. He had seen no blood about, there had been no mark on the long bare throat, and yet the word rushed in his ears, murder. Later on he went back with the police officer. They broke into the house and entered the room. It was in utter darkness, of course, by now. Dent, his fingers trembling, struck a match. It flared round the walls and lighted them for a moment before he let it fall on the dusty floor. The policeman began to light his lantern and turned it stolidly on the window. He had no reason for delay. He was eager to get to the bottom of the business. His professional zeal was whetted. This promised to be a mystery with a spice in it. He turned the light full on the window. He gave a strange, choked cry, half of rage, half of apprehension. Then he went up to Gilbert Dent, who stood in the middle of the room with his hands before his eyes, and took his shoulder and shook it none too gently. "There ain't anybody," he said. Dent looked wildly at the window. The recess was empty except for the work table. The woman was gone. They searched the house. They minutely inspected the garden. Everything was normal. Everything told the same mournful tale, of desertion, of death, of long empty years. But they found no woman, nor trace of one. "This house," said the policeman, looking suspiciously into the lawyer's face, "has been empty for longer than I can remember. Nobody'll live in it. They do say something about foul play a good many years ago. I don't know about that. All I do know is that the landlord can't get it off his hands." It was doubtful if Gilbert Dent heard one word of what the man was saying. He was too stunned to do anything but creep home, when he was allowed to go, and let himself stealthily into his own house with a latch key. He was afraid even of himself. He did not go to bed that night. As for the mystery of the woman, the matter was allowed to drop. It ended officially. There was a shrug and a grin at the police station. The impression there was that the lawyer had been drinking, that the dead woman in the empty room was a gruesome freak of his tipsy brain. A week or so later Dent called on his brother Ned, the one near relation he had. Ned was a doctor. Perhaps he was a shade more matter-of-fact than Gilbert. At all events, When the latter told his story of the house and the woman, he attributed the affair solely to liver. "You are overworked." The elder brother looked at the younger's yellow face. "An experience of this nature is by no means uncommon. Haven't you heard of people having their pet spooks?" "But this was a real woman," he declared. Well, I was in love with her. I had made up my mind to marry her, if I could." Ned gave him a keen, swift glance. "We'll go to Brighton to morrow," he said, with quiet decision. "As for your work, everything must be put aside. You've run completely down. You ought to have been taken in hand before." They went to Brighton, and it really seemed as if Ned was right, and that the woman at the window had been merely a nervous creation. It seemed so, that is, for nearly 3 weeks, and then the climax came. It was in the twilight. She had always been a part of it, that Gilbert Dent saw her again, the woman that he had found lying dead. They were walking, the two brothers, along the cliffs. The wind was blowing in their faces, the sea was booming beneath the cliff. Ned had just said it was about time they turned back to the hotel and had some dinner, when Gilbert with a cry leaped forward to the very edge of the flat grass path on which they were strolling. The movement was so sudden that his brother barely caught him in time. They struggled and swayed on the very edge of the cliff for a second. Gilbert, possessed by some sudden frenzy, seemed resolved to go over, but the other at last dragged him backward, and they rolled together on the close thick turf. At this point Gilbert opened his eyes and tried to get on his feet. "Better?" asked his brother cheerfully, holding out a helping hand. "Strange. The sea has that effect on some people. Didn't think you were one of them." "What effect?" "Vertigo, my dear fellow." "Ned," said the other solemnly, "I saw her. It's not worth your while to try to account for anything. I have been inclined to think that you were right, that she, the woman at the window, was a fancy, that I had fallen in love with a creation of my own brain. But I saw her again to night." "You must have seen her yourself. She was within a couple of feet of you. Why did you not try and save her? It was nothing short of murder to let her go over like that. I did my best." "You certainly did, to kill us both," said Ned grimly. Gilbert gave him a wild look. After luncheon Ned persuaded him to rest, watched him fall asleep, and then went out. In the porch of the hotel he was met by a waiter on his return, who told him that Gilbert had left about a quarter of an hour after he had himself gone out. Directly he heard this he feared the worst, having, as is usual in such cases, a very hazy idea of what the worst might be. Of course he must follow without a moment's delay, but a reference to the time-table told him that there was not another train for an hour, and that was slow. It was already getting dusk when he arrived there. He felt certain that Gilbert would go there. He got to the end of the lane and walked up it slowly, examining every house. There would be no difficulty in recognizing the one he wanted. Gilbert had described it in detail more than once. He stood outside the loosely hanging gate at last, and stared through the darkness at the shabby stucco front and rank garden. He went down a flight of steps to the back door, and finding it unfastened, stepped into a stone passage. It was one of the problems of the place that he should have avoided the main entrance door with a half-admitted dread, and that, only half-admitting still, he was afraid to mount the long flight of stone stairs leading from the servants' quarters. However, he pulled himself together and went up to the room. It was quite dark inside. He heard something scuttle across the floor. He felt the grit and dust of years under his feet. He struck a match, just as Gilbert had done, and looked at first at the recess in which the window was built. The match flared round the room for a moment and gave him a flash picture of his surroundings. He saw the stripes of gaudy paper moving almost imperceptibly, like tentacles of some sea monster, from the wall. He saw a creature, it looked like a rat, scurry across the floor from the window to the great mantelpiece of hard white marble. If he had seen nothing more than this, he saw in detail all that first match had flashed at him. He saw his brother lying on the floor, a ghastly coincidence. His hand was caught round the edge of the work table as hers had been. The other hand was clenched across his breast. There was a look of great agony on his face. A dead face, of course. This was the end of the affair. He was lying dead by the window where the woman had sat every night at dusk and smiled at him. A second match went out. The brother of the dead man struck a third. He looked again closely. Then he staggered to his feet and gave a cry. It rang through the empty rooms and echoed without wearying down the long stone passages in the basement. Gilbert's head was thrown back, his chin peaking to the ceiling. On his throat were vivid marks. The doctor saw them distinctly. He saw the grip of small fingers, the distinct impression of a woman's little hand. The curious thing about the whole story, the most curious thing, perhaps, is that no other eye ever saw those murderous marks. So there was no scandal, no chase after the murderer, no undiscovered crime. They faded. When the doctor saw his brother again in the full light and in the presence of others, his throat was clear. And the post mortem proved that death was due to natural causes. So the matter still stands, and will. But where the house and its overgrown garden stood runs a new road with neat red and white villas. Whatever secret it knew, if any, it kept discreetly. Ned Dent is morbid enough to go down the smart new road in the twilight sometimes and wonder. Sandy's Ghost. "Accommodations for the night, stranger?" "Well, yes. I reckon we can fix a place for you. Have a chair and set you down." "Thank you. Don't you find this rather a lonely place? No neighbors, no nothing, that I can see. How came you to settle here, so far removed from other habitations?" "Well, perhaps it's best not to ask too many questions ter once." "Beg your pardon? No offence was intended, I assure you, simply idle curiosity." "Don't say another word, stranger, but come on in, we'll have a snack for supper. Polly, bring on some victuals. You're just in time." Polly at once obeyed. She was a typical Western girl, tall, lithe, graceful, and limpid-eyed. She was clear-skinned and high-spirited, too, and in this case ignorant through no fault of her own. John Barr's eyes scanned her intently, and a flush came to her cheeks. For the first time in her life she was unpleasantly conscious of her bare feet. It may have been this that made her stumble and spill some of the contents of an earthen bowl over the guest's knees as she placed it on the table. Her eyes flashed and a tear of anger twinkled on the lashes. She stopped, half meaning to apologize, but an oath from her father caused her to set the bowl down heavily and to hurry from the cabin. A moment later Barr saw a flutter of pink calico from behind a pile of rocks. Old Kit Robinson saw it too. "Don't wonder at your sayin' 'tain't right. She's a smart gal, and a good looker, too, as should have been sent away from here ter school ter be eddicated. She won't leave her no 'count dad. I oughter be shot fer cussin' her, but I ain't what I useter be. Settin' here and keepin' guard makes me narvous." Barr's eyes asked the question his lips refused to speak. Supper eaten, the men went outside and sat with their chairs tilted back against the cabin. Something in the younger man's frank face had softened old Kit into a reminiscent mood and made him strangely inclined to gratify an idle curiosity. The soft evening wind sighed through the branches of the tall spruce pines, and the declining rays of the setting sun caused the shadow of the rude home to stretch out longer across the greensward. From its shelter where he sat, John Barr looked out on the grand ranges of the Rockies, and wondered where in their vastness he would find the man he sought, the finding of whom had brought him into this wild and unforsaken mining camp. "Stranger, I've take a likin' ter you. You've been somethin' about you that reminds me of some one I know, and you look like an honest chap." Say, do you believe in ghosts?" He put the question very suddenly, and a look of disappointment crossed his face when Bar told him that he did not believe in spooks. "Wall, I've seen 'em." A thought connecting the pink calico with something in the past came to Bar's mind. "Can't you tell me about it?" he asked. "I'd like ter if you'll swar on yer derringer and never ter blab. Will you swar?" The solitary guest started to smile, but the smile faded at the thought of unshed tears in Polly's eyes. It might make it easier for her if he humored the old man. "I swear," he said, and he did. "Do you see yon old spruce at the turn of the trail in the cliff jes' above? Wall, that's the spot I'm a watchin' and guardin' till the owner comes ter claim it. I'm quick ter burn powder and pretty sure shot. I know a man when I sees him, and I ain't easy fooled. Wall, ter begin with, I had a partner once, and he was a man, sure 'nuff. He was from the State of New York. I never axed him as ter how so fine a gent come ter diggin' and shovelin' in the Rockies, though ter myself I said thar was some good reason. He had light hair, and we called him Sandy, for short, and he was jes' erbout as gritty as sand. We was as unlike as any two fellers you ever saw. He was quiet like and steady, and I was sorter wild and reckless, and I liked mounting due most to well. Wall, when we had a little dust scraped together, we would divvy, and I took my share way down ter the station on the other side of the cliffs and sent her off ter the bank in Helena. But I allers left some hid whar the gal could find it. Old Sandy had a bank of his own that no one knew about, 'ceptin' himself, and every time we divided he'd carry part of it ter his hidin' place, and then give the rest ter me ter send to his boy, that he said was bein' educated in some college way up in Boston. He seemed ter think a heap of that boy. Arter a while my old woman gave out, and soon we laid her away on the hillside. It was hard, stranger." Old Kit's voice failed him for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure and continued. "But when old Sandy, my good old pard, give up I didn't care for nothin'. We buried him in style. All the boys from round the diggin's was thar, and many an eye was wet. We didn't have nary a preacher, but the gal she prayed at the grave. For the life of me I don't know where she larnt it. Reckon the old woman must have told her. Next mornin' the gal showed me a letter that Sandy gave her just 'fore he died. It was ter his boy, and she was ter give it ter him if he ever come out this way, and she got it yet. That same evenin' after supper, feelin' kinder gloomish, and like there was somethin' in my throat I couldn't swaller, I took a stroll up the gulch. I went on out to the top of the ridge of the big rock, and got ter studyin' where I'd find another pard like Sandy. All ter once I felt a hand touch my shoulder kind o' light once or twice. I jumped up, half 'spectin' it was Sandy, but it was only the gal. Well, I was all took back at fust, and then I got mad. 'What air you doin' up here?' I axed, kinder tough. She had tears in her eyes as she looked up at me and said, 'Pap, don't git mad, I was lonesome. I seed you comin' up this way, and I follered you, 'cause I wanted to tell you that Sandy said ter give his boy his pile when he comes.' 'Wall,' says I, 'you might have waited till I come back to the house,' and then I sent her back. Arter she was gone I sot ter studyin' whar in the world Sandy's pile was. I tried ter think where he could have hid it, but it weren't no use. All ter once I noticed it was plumb dark, and these surroundings ain't a healthy place for a man ter roam in arter nightfall, 'specially if he ain't got his shootin' irons on. I cut a pretty swift gait fer the shack. Jes' as I come around the bend thar at the pine, I happened ter look up toward the cliff and thar sot Sandy. Yes, sir, he was him sure as you're born. My feet felt heavy as lead, and I couldn't move from the spot. I tried ter holler, but it weren't no go. Finally I gave a sudden jerk, and made a step toward him, and as I did so he disappeared. Then I made tracks for home, but I kept mum, because I knowed the boys would say that mounting dew was lickin' up my brains, and I would be seein' snakes and sich things 'fore long. The next night, somehow or 'nother, I thought ter go and see ef he was thar agin, and sure 'nuff, thar he sot, lookin' kinder sad and makin' marks on the rocks with his fingers. I had my hand on my gun this time, so I got a little closter than afore. But by hookey, he got away from me agin, nor did he come back. I could hardly wait for the next night ter come around. At the same time I was on hand good and early, jest as it begun ter git dark, and the trees looked like long spooks a stretchin' out their arms. I looked toward the cliff, and thar he sot, markin' and scratchin' on the rock with his fingers and lookin' sad. Now, this bein' the third time, I kinder got bolder, and I went a little closer and says, 'Sandy, what's the matter with you? Didn't the boys do the plantin' right for you?' Then as luck would have it, I thought of somethin' else right quick, and I said, 'Or is it the dust you've hid whar you're settin'?' Wall, he looked up at me then, and the happiest smile come ter his face, and all ter once he disappeared agin. And sence then I've sot here guardin' the place till the right one comes along ter claim it. Let's see, what did you say your name was?" "Pardon me, I thought I told you. My name is John Willett Barr." "Polly, oh, Polly, come you here, gal. What was Sandy's full name? I plumb forgot." "What do you want ter know fur?" she asked. "I ain't goin' ter tell you now. That's my own secret." "Come, come, gal, tell me ter once or it won't be healthy fur you." "Wall, then," she answered stubbornly, "it was John Willett Barr." At her reply the young man's face grew deathly pale, and he started up from his chair, but Kit thrust him back into his seat, saying, "Bring me the letter, Polly." "What are you goin' to do with it, Pa?" she inquired cautiously. "I promised old Sandy on my oath ter keep it till the right one comes erlong ter claim it, and I mean ter keep my word. The right one is here, gal. Thar he sits. So trot that letter out, and don't parley long with me ef you knows when you're well off." Polly stared at the young man in utter bewilderment for a moment. Then, turning slowly, she stepped quietly into the cabin after the precious document. An unusual gleam of joy lighted up her face, and a suppressed excitement shone in her eyes. Under her breath she said, "Somehow or other, I felt he was the right one." Too truly, John Barr realized in that painful moment that whom he sought was now dead to him, that the father from whom he had been parted so many years was sleeping that long, dreamless sleep in the clay mound on the hillside, which marked his last resting place. As he turned to look at the face of old honest Kit, who had been his father's friend during those long years of forced exile, a happy smile lit up the old miner's rugged features as he pointed with his finger to the rock cliff near the old spruce vine, and said in an exultant, trembling voice, "Thar he be, stranger, jest as I have seen him many a night, your dad, my pard, poor old Sandy." With an eager voice John Barr sprang forward, and the mountains echoed and re echoed the plaintive cry of "Father! Father!" But his outstretched arms clasped only emptiness and the darkening shadows of the rapidly approaching night. THE GHOSTS OF RED CREEK by S.T. To the northward of Mississippi City and its neighbor, Hansborough, there extends a tract of pine forest for miles, with but few habitations scattered through it. Black and Red creeks, with their numerous branches, drain this region into the Pascagoula River to the eastward, with the swamps of Pascagoula as a refuge, and the luxuriant and unfrequented bottoms of Red and Black creeks to browse upon. There are few choicer spots for deer. Knowing this fact, a small party of gentlemen on the day before a crisp, cold Christmas started from Hansborough in a large four-wheeled wagon for a 30-mile drive into this wilderness of pine and a week's sport after the deer. The guide was Jim Caruthers, a true woodsman, and the driver a general factotum, a jolly negro named Jack Lyons, than whom no one could make a better hoe cake and cook a venison steak. His laugh could be heard a quarter of a mile, and his good nature was as expansive as the range of the laughter. The usual experiences of a hunting camp were hardly enjoyed during the first days of this life out of doors, but his cream did not rise until about the fifth night, when, from familiar intercourse, Jack Lyons became loquacious, and after the day's 20 or 25 mile walk, would spin yarns in front of the camp fire, which brought forgetfulness of fatigue. The night before New Year's was intensely cold. The cold north wind of the afternoon had subsided at sunset, and only a gust now and again touched the musical leaves of the pines, making them vibrant with that mournful score of nature's operas which even maestros have failed to catch. In front of two new and white tents, two sportsmen reclined at length within reach of the warmth of the fire, while opposite them rested at ease the guide and the worthy Jack Lyons. Wearied with the day's chase, four staunch hounds, Ringwood, Rose, Jet, and Boxer, were dreaming of future quarry. The firelight brought out in bright relief the trunks of the tall pines like cathedral columns, and sparkling through the leafy dome overhead the scintillating stars glistened with diamond brightness. A silence which added its influence to the scene rested about the borders of the creek below, and gave more effect to the story of the veteran teamster than perhaps it otherwise would have had. "If de deer run down de creek," said old Jack, smacking his lips over a carefully prepared brewing of the real Campbellton punch, "we's bound to see fun tomorrer, for dey'll take us down thar by de old Gibbet's place. In daylight dere's no place like it. But after nightfall, you bet you wouldn't ketch dis nigger thah." Old Jack was naturally asked why he didn't care about visiting the Gibbet place that night. Asking to be excused till he filled his pipe, the silence was unbroken till his return. He piled on more pine knots and commenced. "You know, gemmen, dat when de gunboats was in de South, we folks had to travel way back hyeah on dese roads outen de range o' deir big guns. I was 'gaged by Mr. Harrison in haulin' salt from de factory at Mississippi City, and on der beach ober Mobile, and I had been makin' a trip every week or so. Dis back country road was neber thought of by de Federals, and we had good times 'long de way, no shells and no shootin'. De night, gentlemen, I's speakin' of was a Friday, dat yo's all know it's unlucky. Well, you see, I hitched up Betsy and Rose in de lead, and old Fox and Blossom at the pole, and takes de biggest load of salt dat the team eber carried. I starts out and crosses the Biloxi River and Hansborough just as de moon was goin' down. Yes, boss, dese roads weren't no better den than now, and de rain made 'em mighty rough when yer come to de holes. I sat in de seat whistlin', de crows is in de pea patch, and a thinkin' of Sarah Jameson, what was afterwards my wife, when I felt the off forewheel go croosh in a hole up to de hub. I'd made 17 miles out abo Hansborough. I did some cussin', and den went to de fence, about 20 yards off, and took out a rail to prise up the wheel. Den I saw I was at Mr. Gibbet's place. I says to myself, I'll go up to the house and get old Mr. Gibbet to give me a turn. I had gone by thar 2 weeks before and seed the old man. Now, gentlemen, yer listen to me, for what I's tellin' yer is as shore as Jimmy'll blow de horn on de last day. I walked up to de house, and dere I saw a bright light inside. It showed out fro' de windows, and I saw shaders of Miss Gibbet and Mrs. Gibbet on der window curtain. Shore, honey, shore. De front door was shet, and I steps up ter de gallery and knocks wid the butt end of my whip. I didn't knock loud, needer. God bless us all, gen'lemen, de lights went out like dat, and I hears up a laugh, ha, 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 how that set my knees a shakin'. I opens de door, and dere was no sign of anybody. I struck a match, and all de furniture was moved out, and de old red cuttins that I fought I seed was in rags. De whole family was gone for shore. I didn't know 'zactly what to think about them strange voices, but I started back to the wagon when it lightened, and bress God, there in the front yard was 6 graves jest made. Somethin' wrong here, said I, and I builds a fire by the wagon and digs the wheel out. Just den old Squire Pasture come along de road from Mobile, an' he tells me de news. Ole man Gibbet cut de throats of his wife an' 4 children an' shoots hisse'f in de head outen jealousy of his wife. Dey was all buried in de front yard, an' de house was deserted 10 days befo'. Gemmen, when I hear dat, dem miles mek de quickes' time to Mobile eber seed. An' yous kin tell me dar's no ghosts, but you don't ketch me roun' dat log house of Gibbet's 'ceptin' sun's an hour high." Jack looked suspiciously over his shoulder into the darkness and crawled into his blanket, muttering, "It scares dis nigger eben now to tell about that night." Sleep soon fell upon the camp, but the impression of old Jack's story survived the night, and the next day he still asserted its truth. How he caught the ghost. "Yes, the house is a good one," said the agent. "It is in a good neighborhood, and you're getting it at almost nothing. But I think it right to tell you all about it. You are orphans, you say, and with a mother dependent on you. That makes it all the more necessary that you should know. The fact is, the house is said to be haunted." The agent could not help smiling as he said it, and he was relieved to see an answering smile on the 2 faces before him. "Ah, you don't believe in ghosts," he went on, "nor do I, for that matter. But somehow the reputation of the house keeps me from having a tenant long at a time. The place ought to rent for twice as much as it does." "If we succeed in driving out the ghost, you will not raise the rent?" asked the boy, with a merry twinkle in his eye. "Well, no, not this year, at any rate," laughed the agent. And so the house was rented, and the slip of a girl and the tall lad, her brother, went their way. Within a week the family had moved into the house, and were delighted with it. It was large and cool, with wide halls and fine stairways, and with more room than they needed. But that did not matter in the least, for they had always been cramped in small houses, suffering many discomforts, and they never could have afforded such a place as this if it had not been haunted. "Blessings on the ghost!" cried Margaret gaily, as she ran about as merry as a child. "Who would be without a ghost in the house when it brings one like this?" "And it is so near your school," said the mother, "and I used to worry so over the long walk, and David can come home to lunch now, and you don't know what a pleasure that will be." "It seems to me," David gravely explained, "that if I should meet the ghost I would treat him with the greatest politeness, and encourage him to stay. We shall not miss the room he takes, shall we? I think it would be very well to set aside that room over yours, Maggie, for his ghostship's own, for we shall not need that, you know. Besides, the door doesn't shut, and he can go in and out without breaking the lock." And then they all laughed and had a great deal of fun over the ghost, which was a great joke to them. They were very tired that night and slept soundly all night long. When they met the next morning, there was more laughter about the ghost, which was shy about meeting strangers, probably, and had made no effort to introduce himself. For the next 3 days they were all hard at work, trying to bring chaos into something like order. And then it was time for the school to open, and Margaret was to begin teaching, and David inserted an advertisement in the city papers for a maid of all work, who might help their mother in their absence. For one whole day prospective colored servants presented themselves and announced, "Is dis de house dey wants a work lady? No, ma'am, I ain't gwine to work in dis house, ketch me a workin' in no ha'nted house." After which they each and all departed, and others came in their stead. One was secured after a while, but no sooner had she talked across the fence with a neighbor's servant than she too departed. "Never mind, children," said Mrs. Craig wearily, "I would much rather do the work than be troubled in this way." So the maid of all work was dismissed, and the Craig family locked the doors and went to their rooms, worn out with the day's anxieties. They had been in the house 4 days, and there had been neither sight nor sound of the ghost. The very mention of it was enough to start them all to laughing, for they were thoroughly practical people, with a fondness for inquiring into anything that seemed mysterious to them and for understanding it thoroughly before they let it go. David was soon sleeping the sound sleep of healthy boyhood, and all was silent in the house, when Margaret stole softly into his room and laid her hand on his arm. He was not easy to waken, and several minutes had passed before he sat up in bed with an articulate murmur of surprise. "Hush," said Margaret in a whisper, with her hand on his lips. "I want you to come into my room and listen to a sound that I've been hearing for some time." "Doors creaking," suggested David as he began to dress. "Nothing of the kind," was all she said. They walked up the stairway and along the upper hall to the door of the unused room. Something was wrong with the lock, and the door would not stay fastened, as I have said. Something that was not fear thrilled their hearts as they pushed the door further ajar, and stood where they could see every foot of the vacant floor. One of their own boxes stood in the middle of the room, but aside from that, nothing was to be seen, and they looked at one another in silence. "Hold the lamp a minute, Maggie," David said at last, and then he went all over the room, and looked more particularly at its emptiness, and even felt the walls. "Secret panels, you know," he said, with a smile, but it was a very puzzled smile indeed. "I can't see what it could have been," Margaret said, as they went down the stairs. "No, I can't see either, but I'm going to see," said David. "That was a chain, and chains don't drag around by themselves, you know. A ghost could not drag a chain if he were to try." "The conventional ghost very often drags chains," said Margaret, as she closed the door of her room. And then she lay awake all night and listened for the conventional ghost that dragged a chain, but it seemed that the weight of the chain must have worried him, for he was not heard again. The mother had slept through it all, and next morning they gave her a vivid account of the night's adventure. "Perhaps it was someone in the house," she said in alarm. But there were no ghosts within the bounds of possibility, so far as she was concerned, but burglars were very possible indeed. Then Margaret and David both laughed more than ever. "What fun would it be," said David, "for a burglar to get into this house and try to find something worth carrying away?" So they went on to the next night, all three fully determined to spend the night in listening for the ghost, and running him to earth if possible. But it was Margaret that heard the ghost, after all. She had been sleeping and was suddenly startled wide awake, and there, overhead, was the sound of the chain dragging. And just as she was on the point of springing out of bed to call her brother, the chain seemed to go out of the upper room. She lay still and listened, and in a moment she heard it again. It was coming down the stairs. There was no carpet on the stairs, and she could hear the chain drop from step to step, until it had come down the whole way. There it was, almost at the door of her room, and something that was strangely like fear kept her lying still, listening in horrified silence. Then it went along the hall, dragging close to the door, and then further away, and back and forth for a while, and then it began dragging back up the stairs again. Step by step she could hear it drawn over the edge of every step, and by the time it had reached the top, she remembered herself and called David. Again did the brother and sister make a tour of the upper room, with the lamp. Not only that, but they looked into every nook and corner of the upper part of the house, and at last came back baffled. They had seen nothing extraordinary, and they had not heard a sound. "I'm going to see that ghost tonight," David said to his sister the next evening. "How?" "I'm going to sit up all night at the head of the stairs. Don't say anything about it to mother. It might make her uneasy." So after the household were all quiet, David slipped into his place at the head of the stairs, and sat down to his vigil. He had placed a screen at the head of the stairway so that it hid him from view, as if a ghost cared for a screen, and he established himself behind it, and prepared to be as patient as he could. It seemed to him that hours so long had never been devised as those the town clocks told off that night. He bore it until midnight moderately well, because he argued with himself, if there were any ghosts about they would surely walk then. But they were not in a humour for walking, and still the hours rolled on without any developments. He took the fidgets, and had nervous twitches all over him, and at last he could endure it no longer, and had leaned his head back against the wall and was going blissfully to sleep, when he heard a chain dragging just beyond the open door of that unused room. In spite of himself a shiver ran down his back. There was no mistaking it. It was a real chain, if he had ever heard one. More than that, it had left the room, and was coming straight towards the stairs. The hall was dark, and it was impossible for him to see anything, although he strained his eyes in the direction of the sound. And even while he looked it had passed behind the screen, and was going down the stairs, dropping from step to step with a clank. Halfway down a narrow strip of moonlight from a stair window lay directly across the steps. Whatever the thing was, it must pass through that patch of light, and David leaned forward and watched. Down it went from step to step, and presently it slipped through the light, and was down. And a little later it came back again, through the light, and up the stairs, and back into that unused room. And then David slapped his knees jubilantly, and ran down to his room, and slept all the rest of the night. Next morning he was very mysterious about his discoveries of the night before. "Oh, yes, I saw the ghost," he said to Maggie. "There, don't ask so many questions. I'll tell you more about it tomorrow, maybe." And that was all the information she could get from him. It was very provoking. That day David made a purchase downtown and brought home a bulky bundle, which he hid in his own room and would not let his sister even peep at it. "I'm going to try to catch the ghost tonight," he said, "and you know how it is. If I brag too much beforehand, I shall be sure to fail." He was working with something in the hall after the others had retired, but he did not sit up this time. He went to bed, and Margaret listened at his door and found that he was soon asleep. But away in the night they were all awakened by a squealing that brought them all into the hall in a great hurry, and there, at the head of the stairs, they found a huge rat trap that David had set a few hours before, and in the midst of the toils was a rat. "Why, David," exclaimed the mother, "I didn't know that there was a rat in the house." And then, all at once, she saw that there was a long chain hanging from a little iron collar round the creature's neck, and she and Margaret cried together. And this was the ghost. Such a funny ghost when they came to think of it, this poor rat, with a nest in some hole of the broken chimney. He had been some one's pet once, perhaps. And now, the households he had broken up, the nights he had disturbed, the wild sensations he had created, it made his captors laugh to think that this innocent creature had been the cause of the whole trouble. "I'll get a cage for him, and take care of him for the rest of his life," said David. "We owe him so much that we can't afford to be ungrateful." The next morning he took the ghost in a cage and showed it to the agent, and gave him a vivid account of the capture. "So you have a good house for about half the price, all on account of that rat," exclaimed the agent, grimly. "Young man, but never mind, you deserve it. What are you working for now? $6 a week? If you ever want to change your place, suppose you come around here. I think you need a business that will give you a chance to grow." And the agent and David shook hands warmly over the cage of the ghost. Granddame's Ghost Story by C.D. I don't know whether you ever tell your children ghost stories or not. Some mothers don't. But our mother, though of German descent, was strong-minded on the ghost subject, and early taught all her children to be fearless mentally as well as physically. And, though dearly fond of hearing ghost stories, especially if they were real true ghosts, we were sadly skeptical as to there being anything of the kind that could harm. We were quite learned in ghostly lore, knew all about doppelgangers, will-o'-the-wisp, blue lights, etc., and we could not have a greater treat for good behaviour than for our mother to draw on her store of supernatural tales for our entertainment. The story I am about to relate she told us one stormy night, when gathered round her chair in her cosy sanctum, before a cheerful fire, we ate nuts and apples, and listened while she recited an o'ertrue tale told her by her grandmother, who herself witnessed the vision. It was a fearful night. The wind sobbed and wailed round the house like lost spirits mourning their doom. The rain beat upon the casements, and the trees, writhing in torture of the fierce blast, groaned and swayed till their tops almost swept the earth. Bright flashes of lightning pierced even the most closed shutters and heavy curtains, and the thunder had a sullen, threatening roar, that made your blood creep. It was a night to make one seek to shut out all sound, draw the curtains close, stir the fire, and nestle deep in the armchair before it, with feet upon the fender, and have something cheerful to think or talk about. But I was all alone, none in the house with me but servants, and the servants' wing was detached from the main part of the building, for I do not care to have menials near me, and I had no loved ones near. It was just such a night that Nancy Black died. What a fearful night for the soul to leave its earthly home and go out into the vast, unknown future! I spoke aloud, as rousing from a train of thought, I drew my heavy mantle closer round me, wheeled my armchair nearer the fire, and cuddled down in it, burying my feet in the foot cushion to warm them, for I felt strangely cold. I was in the library. It was my usual sitting room, for I seldom used the parlours. What was the use? My books were my friends, and I loved best to be with them. My children dead, or married and away, the cold, grand parlours always seemed gloomy and sad. The ghosts of the departed pleasures haunted them, and I cared not to enter them. It was a long wide room across the hall from the parlours, running the whole length of the house, and was lined with shelves from floor to ceiling. My husband's father had been a bibliomaniac, and my husband had had a leaning that way also, and the shelves held so many an old rare work that was worth its weight in gold. The fire, though burning brightly, did not illume half the room, of which, sitting in the chimney corner, I commanded a full view, and had been looking at the shadows playing on the furniture and shelves, as the flame shot up, and after flickering a moment would die out, leaving a gloom which would break away into fantastic shadows as the firelight would shoot up again. While watching the gleams of light and darkling shades, unconsciously the wailing of the storm outside attracted my attention. There seemed to be odd noises of tapping on the windows, and sobs and sighs, as though someone was entreating entrance from the fierce tumult. And as I sat there, again I thought of Nancy Black, the old school-girl friend who had loved me so dearly, and the night when she went forth to meet the doom appointed her. Resting my head upon my hand, I sat gazing in the fire, thinking over her strange life, and still stranger death, and wondering what could have become of the money and jewels that I knew she had once possessed. While sitting thus, a queer sensation crept over me. It was not fear, but a feeling as though if I looked up I'd see something frightful. A shiver, not like that of cold, ran from my head to my feet, and a sensation as though someone was breathing ice-cold breath upon my forehead, the same feeling you would cause by holding a piece of ice to your cheek. It fluttered over my face and finally settled round my lips, as though the unseen one was caressing me, thrilling me with horror. But I am not fearful, nervous, nor imaginative, and resolutely throwing off the dread that fell upon me, I turned round and looked up, and there, so close by my side that my hand, involuntarily thrown out, passed through her seeming form, stood Nancy Black. It was Nancy Black, and yet not Nancy Black. Her whole body had a semi-transparent appearance, just as your hand looks when you hold it between yourself and a strong light. Her clothing, apparently the same as worn in life, had a wavy, seething, flickering look, like flames have, and yet did not seem to burn. "In the name of God, Nancy Black, what brought you here, and whence came you?" I exclaimed. A hollow whisper followed. "Thank you, my old friend, for speaking to me, and oh, how deeply I thank you for thinking of me to night. I shall have rest." "Rest!" I heard echoed, and a jeering laugh rang through the room that made her quiver at its sound. "I have been near you often, but always failed to find you in a condition when you would be en rapport before to night. What I came for I will tell you; whence I come you need not know. Suffice it to say, that were I happy I would not be here on such an errand, nor on such a night. It is only when the elements are in tumult, and the winds wail and mourn, that we come forth. When you hear these sounds it is souls of the lost you hear mourning their doom. 'Tis then they wander up and down, to and fro, their only release from their fearful home of torture and undying pain. I have come to tell you that you must go over to the old house, and in the back room I always kept locked, have the carpet taken up from toward the fireplace. You will see a plank with a knot hole in it. Remove that, and you will find what caused me to lose my soul. Have prayer said for me, for 'tis well to pray for the dead. The money and jewels give in charity. Bury in holy ground the others you find, and pray for them and me. Ah, Jeanette, you thought your old friend, though strange and odd, pure and innocent. It is a bitter part of my punishment that I must change your thought of me. Farewell! Do not fail me, and I shall trouble you no more. But whenever you hear that wind howl and sweep round the house as it does to night, know that the lost are near. It is their swift flight through space, fleeing before the scourge of memory and conscience, that causes that sound. That to morrow you may not think you are dreaming, here is a token." And she touched the palm of my hand with her finger tips. "And as you see, my child, to this day, there are 3 crimson spots on the palm of my hand that nothing will eradicate. Do not fail me, and pray for us. Jeanette, pray." And with a longing, wistful gaze, and a deep sobbing sigh, Nancy Black faded from my sight. "Am I dreaming?" I exclaimed, as I rose from my chair and rang the bell. When the servant entered, I bade him attend to the fire and light the lamps, and I went through the room to see if any unusual arrangement of furniture could have caused the appearance, but nothing was apparent, and I bade him send my maid to attend me in my chamber, for I could not help feeling unwilling to remain in the library any longer that evening. While making my toilet for the night my maid said, "Have you burned your hand, madam?" Glancing hastily down, I saw 3 dark crimson spots upon the palm of my left hand. They had an odd look, seared as though touched by a red hot iron, yet the flesh was soft, not burned and not painful. Making some excuse for it, I did not allude to it again, and dismissed her speedily, that I might reflect undisturbed over the singular occurrence. There were marks upon my hand, I could not remove them, and they did not fade. In fact, their deep red made the rest of the palm lose its pinkish hue and look pale from the strong contrast. Could I have been asleep and dreamed it all, and by any means have done this to myself? I thought, but finally concluded that on the morrow I'd go over to Nancy Black's old residence and settle the question, and with that conclusion had to content myself until the morrow came. Nancy Black was an old friend from my girlhood, who had owned a large property in the town, and lived all alone in a spacious stone house directly opposite my home, and who, when dying, had left me the sole legatee of her property. When morning came I took the keys, and with my maid went over to Nancy's house. It had never been disturbed since her death, which was sudden and somewhat singular, and the furniture remained just as she left it when taken to her last resting place. We went into the room Nancy had directed. I bade Sarah take up the carpet, and sure enough, there was a plank with a knot hole in it. So I sent her from the room, and lifted the plank myself. And there, between the 2 joints, rested a long box, the lid not fastened. Opening it, I was horrified to see 2 skeletons, those of an infant and of a woman, small in stature and delicate frame. In a moment it flashed before me that I saw all that remained of Nancy Black's younger sister, a girl of 17, who had left home somewhat mysteriously years ago, and had died while absent. At least that was the version Nancy had given of her absence, and no one had dreamed of doubting it, her tale was so naturally told. Left orphan when Lucy was only 2 years and Nancy 18, she had devoted her life to the care of this young girl, and when she found her sister had fallen, she, in her pride of name and position, had destroyed mother and child that her shame might not be known, and had lived all those dreary years in that house with her fearful secret. Round the box, heaped up on every side, were money and jewels, and a parchment scroll among them had written on it, "Lucy's share of our father's estate." I carried out Nancy's wishes to the letter, for now I firmly believed that she had come to me herself that night. To avoid scandal resting on the dead, I took our clergyman into my confidence, and with his assistance had the remains buried quietly in consecrated ground. The money and jewels were given to the poor, and the old building I turned into a home for destitute females. And morning and night, as I kneel in prayer, I pray forgiveness to rest upon Nancy Black and peace to her troubled soul. A Fight with a Ghost by Q.E.D. "No, I never believed much in ghosts," said the doctor, "but I was always rather afraid of them." "Have you ever seen one?" asked one of the other men. The doctor took his cigar out of his mouth and contemplated the ash for a moment or two before replying. "I have had some rather startling experiences," he said, after a pause, during which the rest of us exchanged glances. For the doctor has seen many things and is not averse to talking about them in congenial company. "Would you care to hear about one of them? It gives me the cold shivers now to speak of it." We nodded, and the doctor, taking a sip as an antidote to the shivers, began. "You remember George Carson, who played for the varsity some years ago, big chap, with a light mustache? Well, I saw a good deal of him before he married, while he was reading for the bar in town. It was just after he became engaged to Miss Stoner, who is now Mrs. Carson, that he asked me to go down to a place which his people had taken in the country. Miss Stoner was to be there, and he wanted me to meet her. I could not go down for Christmas Day, as I had promised to be with my people. But as I had been working a bit too hard, and wanted a few days' rest, I decided to run down for a few days about the New Year. Woodcote was a pleasant enough place to look at. There were 2 packs of hounds within easy distance, and it was not far enough from the station to cut you off completely from the morning papers. The Carsons had been lucky, I thought, in coming across such a good house at such a moderate figure. For, as George told me, the owner had been obliged to go abroad for his health, and was anxious not to leave the place empty all the winter. It was an old house, with big gables and preposterous corners all over the place, and you couldn't walk 10 paces along any of the passages without tumbling up or down stairs. But it had been patched from time to time, and, among other improvements, a big billiard room had been built out at the back. A country house in the winter without a billiard room, when the frost stops hunting, is just, well, not even a gilded prison. The party was a small one. Besides George and his father and mother, there were only a couple of Mrs. Carson, who, being somewhere in the early teens, didn't count, and Miss Stoner, who, of course, counted a good deal, and lastly myself. Miss Stoner ought to have been happy, for George Carson, besides being an excellent fellow all around, was by no means a bad match, being an only son with considerable expectations. But somehow or other, she did not strike me as looking either very well or very happy. She gave me the impression of having something on her mind, which made her alternately nervous and listless. George, I fancied, noticed it, and was puzzled by it, for I caught him several times watching her with an anxious and inquiring look. But as I was not there as a doctor, of course it was no business of mine, though I discovered the reason before I left Woodcote. The second night after my arrival, we had been playing, I remember, a family pool. The rest had gone upstairs to bed. George and I adjourned to a sort of study, which he had arranged upstairs, for a final smoke and a chat before turning in. The study was next to his bedroom, and parted off from it by a curtain. As we were settling down I missed my pipe, and remembered that I had laid it down in the billiard room. On principle I never smoke another man's pipe, so I lit a candle, the house being in darkness, and started away in search of my own. The house looked awfully weird by the flickering light of a solitary candle, and the stairs creaked in a particularly gruesome way behind me, just for all the world as though someone were following at my heels. I found my pipe where I had expected in the billiard room, and came back in perhaps a little more hurry than was absolutely necessary. Which perhaps explains why I stumbled in the uncertain light over a couple of unforeseen stairs, and dropped my candle. Of course it went out, but after a little groping I found it. Having no matches with me, I was obliged to feel my way along the banisters, for it was so dark that I could not see my hand in front of me. And as I slowly advanced, sliding my hand along the broad balustrade at my side, it suddenly slid over something cold and clammy, which was not a balustrade at all. For stopping dead, and closing my fingers round it for an instant, I felt that I was holding another hand, a skinny, bony hand, which writhed itself slowly from my grasp. And though I could hear nothing and see nothing, I was yet conscious that something was brushing past me and going up the stairs. "Hi! What's that? Who are you?" I called. There was no answer. I admit that I was in a regular funk. I must have shown it in my face. "What's the matter?" asked George, as I blundered into his study. "Oh, nothing," I answered. "Dropped my candle and lost the way." "But who were you talking to?" "I was only swearing at the candle," I replied. "Oh, I thought perhaps you had seen somebody," replied George. Somehow I did not like to tell him the truth, for fear he would laugh at my nervousness. But I determined to keep an eye on my liver, and take a couple of weeks' complete rest. That night I woke up several times with the feeling of that confounded hand under my own, a clammy hand which writhed as my fingers closed upon it. The next morning after breakfast I was in the billiard room practising strokes while Carson was over at the stables. Presently the door opened, and Miss Stoner looked in. "Come in," I said. "George will be back from the stables in a few minutes. Meanwhile we can 50 up." "I wanted to speak to you," she said. She was looking very tired and ill, and I began to think I should not have an uninterrupted holiday after all. "Do you believe in ghosts?" she asked, having closed the door and come up to the table, where she stood leaning with both her hands upon it. "No," I replied, missing an easy caroom as I remembered my experience of last night, "but I believe in fancy." "And supposing then that a person fancied he saw things, is there any remedy?" "What do you mean, Miss Stoner?" I replied, looking at her in some surprise. "Do you mean that you fancy—" I stopped, for Miss Stoner turned away, sat down on one of the easy chairs by the wall, and burst into tears. "Oh, please help me," she sobbed. "I believe I'm going mad." I laid down my cue and went over to her. "Look here, Miss Stoner," I said, taking her hand, which was hot and feverish. "I am a doctor, and a friend of George. Now tell me all about it, and I'll do my best to set it right." She was in a more or less hysterical condition, and her words were freely punctuated by sobs. But gradually I managed to elicit from her that nearly every night since she came to Woodcote she had been awakened in some mysterious way, and had seen a horrible face looking at her from over the top of a screen which stood by the door of her bedroom. As soon as she moved the face disappeared, which convinced her that the apparition existed only in her imagination. That seemed to distress her even more than if she had believed it to be a genuine ghost, for she thought her brain was giving way. I told her that she was only suffering from a very common symptom of nervous disorder, as indeed it was, and promised to send a groom into the village to get a prescription made up for her. And, having made me promise to breathe no word to any one on the subject, more especially to George, she went away relieved. Nevertheless, I was not quite certain that I had made a correct diagnosis of the case. You see, I had been rather upset myself not many hours before. George was longer than I expected at the stable, and I was just going to find him when at the door I met Mrs. Carson. "Can you spare me a moment?" she said, as I held open the door for her. "I wanted to find you alone." "Certainly, Mrs. Carson, with pleasure. An hour, if you wish," I replied. "It is so convenient, you know, to have a doctor in the house," she said, with a nervous laugh. "Now I want you to prescribe me a sleeping draught. My nerves are rather out of order, and I don't sleep as I should." "Ah," I said, "do you see faces and such like things when you wake?" "How do you know?" she asked quickly. "Oh, I inferred from the other symptoms. We doctors have to observe all kinds of little things." "Well, of course, I know it's only a fancy, but it is just as bad as if it were real. I assure you it is making me quite ill, and I didn't like to mention it to Mr. Carson or to George. They would think I was losing my head." I gave Mrs. Carson the same prescription as I had written for Miss Stoner, though by that time the conviction had grown upon me that there was something wrong which could not be cured by medicine. However, I decided to say nothing to George about the matter at present, for I could hardly utilise the confidence which had been placed in me by Miss Stoner and Mrs. Carson, and my own experience of the night before would scarcely have appeared convincing to him. But I determined that on the next day, which was Sunday, I would invent an excuse for staying at home from church and make some explorations in the house. There was obviously some mystery at work which wanted clearing up. We all sat up rather late that night. There seemed to be a general disinclination to go to bed. We stayed all together in the billiard room until nearly midnight, and then loitered about in the hall, talking in an aimless sort of fashion. But at last Mrs. Carson said good night, with a confidential nod to me, and Miss Stoner murmured, "So many thanks, I've got it," and they both went upstairs. George and I parted in the corridor above. Our rooms were opposite each other. I did not begin undressing at once, but sat down and tried to piece together some theory to account for the uncanniness of things. But the more I thought, the more perplexing it became. There was no doubt whatever that I had put my hand on something extremely alive and extremely unpleasant the night before. The bare recollection of it made me shudder. What living thing could possibly be creeping about the house in the dark? It was a man's hand, of that I was certain from the size of it. George Carson was out of the question, for he was in his room all the time. Nor was it likely that Mr. Carson senior would steal about his own house in his socks and refuse to answer when spoken to. The only other man in the house was an eminently respectable looking butler, and his hand, as I had noted particularly when he poured out my wine at dinner, was plump and soft, whereas the mysterious hand on the balustrade was thin and bony. And then, what was the real explanation of the face which had appeared to the two ladies? Indigestion might have explained either singly. Extraordinary coincidents do sometimes occur, but it seemed too extraordinary that a couple of ladies, one old and one young, should suffer from the same indigestion in the same house, at the same time, and with the same symptoms. On the whole, I did not feel at all comfortable, and looked carefully in all the cupboards and recesses, as well as under the bed, before starting to undress. Then I went to the door, intending to lock it. Just as my hand was upon the key, I heard a soft step in the corridor outside, accompanied by a sound which was something between a sigh and a groan. Very faint, but quite unmistakable, and, under the circumstances, discomposing. It might of course be George. Anyhow, I decided to look and see. I turned the handle gently and opened the door. There was nothing to be seen in the corridor. But on the opposite side I could see a door open, and George's head peeping round the corner. "Hello," he said. "Hello," I replied. "Was that you walking up the passage?" he asked. "No," I answered, "I thought it might be you." "Then who the devil was it?" he said. "I'll swear I heard some one." There was silence for a few moments. I was wondering whether I had still better tell him of the fright I had already had, when he spoke again. "I say, just come in here for a bit, old fellow. I want to speak to you." I stepped across the passage, and we went together into the little study which adjoined his bedroom. "Look here," he said, poking up the fire, which was burning low, "doesn't it strike you that there is something very odd about this house?" "You mean—" "Well, I wouldn't say anything about it to the master or Miss Stoner for fear of frightening them. All the same, scarcely a night passes but I hear curious footsteps on the stairs. You've heard them yourself, haven't you?" "Now you mention it," I said, "I confess I have." "And, what is more," he continued, "I was sitting here 2 nights ago half asleep, and it seems ridiculous, I know, but it's a fact. I suddenly saw a horrible face glaring at me from between those curtains behind you. It was gone in a moment, but I saw it as plainly as I see you." I moved my seat uneasily. "Did you look in your bedroom or in the passage?" I asked. "Yes, at once," he replied. "There was nothing to be seen. But twice again that night I heard footsteps passing. Good God!" He started up in his chair, staring straight over my shoulder. I turned quickly and saw the curtains which parted off the bedroom swing together. "What is it?" I asked breathlessly. "I saw it again! The same face, between the curtains!" I tore the curtains aside and rushed into the next room. It was empty. The lamp was burning upon a side table, and the door was open, just as George had left it. In the passage outside all was quiet. I came back into the study and found George running his fingers through his hair in perplexity. "There is clearly one person too many in the house," I said. "I think we ought to draw the place and find out who it is." "All right," he said, picking up the poker from the fireplace. "If it's anything made of flesh and blood this will be useful, and if not—" He stopped short, for at that instant the most awful shriek of horror rang through the house, a shriek of wild, uncontrollable terror, such as I had never heard before, and I never hope to hear again. One moment we stood staring at each other, dumbfounded. The next, George Carson had dashed out of the room and down the corridor to the stairs. I followed close behind him, for we both knew that none but a woman in mortal fear would shriek like that, and that that woman was Miss Stoner. Down the stairs we tumbled pell-mell in the darkness. But before I reached the landing below, where Miss Stoner's room was, I felt, as I had felt that evening before, something brush swiftly past me. As I ran I turned and caught at it in the dark, but my hand gripped only empty air. I was just about to turn back and follow it, when a cry from George arrested me, and, looking down, I saw him standing over the prostrate form of Miss Stoner. The door of her room was open, and by the moonlight which streamed into the room I could see her lying in her white night-dress across the threshold. What followed in the next few minutes I can scarcely recall with accuracy. The whole house was aroused by the poor girl's awful shriek. She was quite unconscious when we came upon her, but she revived more or less as soon as Mrs. Carson and one of the terrified servants had lifted her into bed again. Nothing intelligible could be gathered from her, however, as to the cause of her fright. She only repeated hysterically again and again, "Oh, the face, the face!" When I saw I could do her no further good for the present, I took George by the arm and led him out of the room. "Look here, George," I said, "we must find out the reason of this at once. I am certain I felt something go by me as I came downstairs. Now does that staircase lead anywhere but to our rooms?" George considered for a moment. "Yes," he replied, "there is a door at the end of the passage which leads up into a sort of lumber room." "Then we'll explore it," I said. "For my part I can't go to sleep until I've got to the bottom of this. Get the man to bring a lantern along." The butler looked as though he didn't half like the enterprise, and to tell the truth, no more did I. It was the uncanniest job I ever undertook. However, we started, the three of us. First of all we searched the rooms on the floor above, where George and I slept. Everything was just as we had left it. Then I pushed open the door at the end of the corridor. A crazy-looking staircase led up into the darkness. We went cautiously up, I first with a candle, then George, and last of all the butler with a lantern. At the top we stepped into a big, rather low room, with beams across the ceiling, and a rough, uneven floor. Our lights threw strange shadows into the corners, and more than once I stared at what looked like a crouching human figure. We searched every corner. There was nothing to be seen but a few old boxes, a roll or two of matting, and some broken chairs. But in the far corner George pointed out to me a rickety ladder which ended in a closed trap door. Just then I distinctly heard the curious half groaning, half sighing sound which had already puzzled me in the corridor below. We stood still and looked at one another. We all heard the sound. "Whatever it is, it's up there," I said. "The question is, who's going up?" George put his candle down upon the floor and stepped upon the ladder. It cracked beneath his weight. He stopped. "Come down. It won't bear you," I said. "I shall have to go." I don't know that I was ever in such a queer funk as I was while I slowly mounted that ladder, and pushed open the trap door. I had formed no clear idea of what I expected to find there. Certainly I was not prepared for what happened. For no sooner was the trap door fully open than there fell, literally fell, upon me from the darkness above, a thing in human shape, which kicked and spat and tore at me as I stood clinging to the ladder. It lasted but a moment or so, but in that moment I lived a lifetime of terror. The ladder swayed and cracked beneath me, and I fell to the floor with the thing gripping my throat like a vice. The next instant George had stunned it with a blow from the poker and dragged it off me. It lay upon its back on the floor, a ragged, hideous, loathsome shape. And the mystery was solved. "But you haven't told us what it really was," said one of the listeners. The doctor smiled. "It was the owner of the house," he replied. "He had not gone abroad. He had gone to a private lunatic asylum with homicidal mania upon him. About a fortnight before this he had managed to escape, and having made his way to his former home, had concealed himself with a cunning often shown by lunatics in the loft. I suppose he had found enough to eat in his nightly rambles about the house. The only wonder is he didn't kill someone before he was caught." The Ghost of the Count. Not far from the Alameda, in the city of Mexico, there is a great old stone building, in which once lived a very wealthy and wicked Spanish count. The house has about 4 floors and 90 rooms, more or less. The entire 4th floor is rented and occupied by a big American firm, and their bookkeeper, an American girl, has given us the following true account of the ghost that for years haunted the building. The 2nd floor is unoccupied, as no one cares to live there for obvious reasons. And the bottom floor is also unoccupied, save for lumber rooms, empty boxes, and crates and barrels. And last of all is the great patio with its tiled floor, where secretly in the night a duel was fought to the death by the wicked count and a famous Austrian prince, who was one of Maximilian's men. The count was killed. No one knows why the duel was fought. Some say it was because of a beautiful Spanish woman. Some say it was because of a treasure that the two jointly conveyed, and which the count refused to divide with his princely socio. And more people, Mexicans, shrug their shoulders if you ask about it, and say, "Quien sabe?" "I saw a ghost here last night, Miss James," announces our cashier with much éclat and evident pride. So great is the shock that I gasp, and my pen drops, splattering ink on my nice fresh cuffs, and, worse luck, on the ledger page I had just totted up. It is ruined, and I will have to erase it, or something. Wretched man! I wish to goodness it had taken you off, I cry, wrathfully, and I look at the bespattered work. Now will you just look here and see what you have done? I wish you and your ghosts were in Gehenna, he inquires, sweetly. I'll fix that. It won't take half a minute. And don't look so stern, else I won't tell you about the espanto, and you will be sorry if you don't hear about it. It would make such a good story. Then go ahead with it. Well, last night I was waiting for West. He was to meet me here, after which it was our intention to hit that is, I mean we were going out together. I nod scornfully. And it seems that while I was patiently waiting here, in my usual sweet-tempered way, the blank idiot had his supper and then lay down to rest himself for a while. You know how delicate he is. Another contemptuous nod. Unfortunately he forgot the engagement and slept on. He says he never awoke until 3 o'clock, and so didn't come, thinking I wouldn't be there. Meantime I also went to sleep and might have snoozed on until 3 likewise, but for the fact that the ghost woke me. Well, do go on, I urge. The ghost woke me, as I said, proceeds the simpleton slowly. It was passing its cold fingers over my face and moaning. Really, it was most extraordinary. At first I didn't know what it was. Then, as I felt the icy fingers stroking my face and heard blood-curdling groans issuing from the darkness, I knew what it was. And I remembered the story of the prince and his little duel down in the patio, and knew it was the ghost of the prince's victim. By the way, you don't know what a funny sensation it is to have a ghost pat your face, Miss James. Pat nothing, I retort indignantly. I wonder you are not ashamed to tell me such fibs. Such a taradiddle. And as for the man that the prince killed downstairs, you know as well as I do that he was taken home to Spain and buried there. Why, then, should he come back here, into our offices and pat your face? Ah, that I can't say, with a supercilious drawl. I can only account for it by thinking that the ghost has good taste, better than that of some people I know. But honestly, I swear I'm telling you the truth. Cross my heart and hope to die if I'm not. And you don't know how brave I was. I never screamed. In fact, never made a sound. Oh, I was brave. Then what did you do? Sternly. I ran. Por Dios, how I ran. You remember with what alacrity we got down the stairs during the November earthquake? I remember only too distinctly. Well, last night's run wasn't a run, in comparison. It was a disappearance, a flight, a sprint. I went down the 4 flights of stairs like a streak of blue lightning, and the ghost flew with me. I heard the pattering of its steps and its groans clean down to the patio door, and I assure you I quite thought I had made such an impression that it was actually going home with me. And the thought made me feel so weak that I felt perforce obliged to take that is, strengthen myself with a cocktail. After which I felt stronger and went home peacefully. But it was an uncanny experience, wasn't it? Was it before or after taking that cocktail? I asked incredulously. And did you take one only or 11? I am hard on the man, but he really deserves it. Ghosts, spirits, perhaps, but not ghosts, whereat his feelings are quite hurted, so much so that he vows he will never tell me anything again. I had better read about Doubting Thomas. He never has seen such an unbelieving woman in all his life, and if I were only a man he would be tempted to pray that I might see the ghost. It would serve me right. Then wrathfully departs, to notice me no more that day. Not believing the least bit in ghosts, I gave the matter no more thought. In fact, when you fell heir to a set of books that haven't been posted for 19 days, and you have to do it all, and get up your trial balance too, or else give up your Christmas holidays, you haven't much time to think about ghosts or anything else, except entries. And though I had been working 14 hours per day, the 24th of December, noon hour, found me with a difference of $13.89. the which I, of course, must locate and straighten out before departing next morning on my week's holiday. Por supuesto, it meant night work. Nothing else would do, and besides, our plans had all been made to leave on the 8 o'clock train next morning. So I would just sit up all night, if need be, and find the wretched balance and be done with it. Behold me settled for work that night at 7 o'clock in my own office, with 3 lamps burning to keep it from looking dismal and lonely, and books and ledgers and journals piled up 2 feet high around me. If hard work would locate that nasty, hateful $13.89, it would surely be found. I had told the portero downstairs on the ground floor to try and keep me awake for a time, but if I didn't soon finish the work I would come down and call him when I was ready to go home. He lived in a little room, all shut off from the rest of the building, so that it was rather difficult to get at him. Besides, he was the very laziest and sleepiest peon possible, and though he was supposed to take care of the building at night, patrolling it so as to keep off the ladrones, he in reality slept so soundly that the last trumpet, much less Mexican robbers, would not have aroused him. And for this very reason, before settling to my work I was careful to go round and look to locks and bolts myself. Everything was secure, and the doors safely fastened, so that if ladrones did break through they would have to be in shape to pass through keyholes or possess false keys. With never a thought of spirits or poteros, or anything else, beyond the $13.89, I worked and added and re-added and footed up. And at 11 o'clock, gracias a Dios, I had the $13 all safe, and would have whooped for joy, had I the time. However, I wasn't out of the woods yet, the sum of $89 being often more easy of location than 89¢. The latter must be found also, before I could have the pleasure of shouting in celebration thereof. At it I went again. After brain cudgelling and more adding and prayerful thought, I at last had under my thumb that abominable 80¢. Eureka! Only 9 cents out. I could get it all straight and have some sleep, after all. Inspired by which thought I smothered my yawns, and again began to add. I looked at my watch, 10 minutes to 12. Perhaps I could get it fixed before 1. I suppose I had worked at the 9 cents for about 20 minutes. One of the cash entries looked to me to be in error. I compared it with the voucher. Yes, that was just where the trouble lay. 11 cents, 10, 9. Sst! Out went the lights in the twinkling of an eye, as I sat, gaping in my astonishment. Out from the pitchy darkness of the room came the most dreary, horrible, blood-curdling groan imaginable. As I sat paralyzed, not daring to breathe, doubting my senses for a moment, and then thinking indignantly that it was some trick of that wretched cashier, I felt long, thin, icy fingers passing gently over my face. Malgame Dios! What a sensation! At first I was afraid to move. Then I nervously tried to brush the icy, bony things away. As fast as I brushed, with my heart beating like a steam hammer, and gasping with deadly fear, the fingers would come back again. A cold wind was blowing over me. Again came that dreadful groan, and too frightened to move or scream, I tumbled in a heap on the floor, among the books and ledgers. Then I suppose I fainted. When I regained my senses I was still in a heap with the ledgers. It was still dark, and I still felt the cold fingers caressing my face. At which I became thoroughly desperate. No ghost should own me. I had laughed at the poor cashier and hinted darkly at cocktails. Pray, what better was I? I scrambled to my feet, the fingers still stroking my face. I must address them. What language did they understand, English or Spanish, I wondered. Spanish would doubtless be most suitable, if indeed it was the ghost of the murdered count. "Will you do me the favor, Señor Ghost," I started out bravely, in my best Spanish, but with a very trembling voice, "to inform me what it is you desire? Is there anything I can do for you? Because, if not, I would like very much to be allowed to finish my work, which I cannot do, if you will pardon my abruptness, if I am not alone." Being the ghost of a gentleman and a diplomat, surely he would take the hint and vanish. Ojalá! Perhaps the ghost did not understand my Spanish. At any rate there was no articulate reply. There was another groan. Again the fingers touched me, and then there was such a mournful sigh that I felt sorry for the poor thing. What could be the matter with it? With my pity, all fear was lost for a moment, and I said to the darkness all about me, "What is it that you wish, pobre signor? Can I not aid you? I am not afraid. Let me help you." The fingers moved uncertainly for a moment. Then the ledgers all fell down, with a loud bang. A cold hand caught mine, very gently. I tried not to feel frightened, but it was difficult, and I was led off blindly through the offices. I could not see a thing, not a glimmer of light showed, not a sound was heard except my own footsteps, and the faint sound of the invisible something that was leading me along. There were no more groans, thank goodness, else I should have shrieked and fainted, without a doubt. Only the pattering footsteps and the cold hand that led me on and on. We, the fingers and I, were somehow in the great hall, then on the second floor, and at last on the stairs, going down flight after flight. I knew that I was being led about by the fingers on the tiled floor of the patio, and close to the Potero's lodge. Simpleton that he was, sleeping like a log no doubt, while I was being led about in the black darkness by an invisible hand, and no one to save me. I would have yelled, of course, but for one fact. I found it utterly impossible to speak or move my tongue, being a rare and uncomfortable sensation. But where were we going? Back into the unused lumber rooms, joining into the patio? Nothing there, except barrels and slabs and empty boxes. What could the ghost mean? He must be utterly demented, surely. In the middle of the first room we paused. I had an idea of rushing out and screaming for the Potero, but abandoned it when I found that my feet wouldn't go. I heard steps passing to and fro about the floor, and waited, cold and trembling. They approached me. Again my hand was taken, and I was led over near the corner of the room. Obedient to the unseen will, I bent down and groped about the floor, guided by the cold fingers holding mine, until I felt something like a tiny ring, set firmly in the floor. I pulled at it faintly, but it did not move, at which the ghost gave a faint sigh. For a second the cold fingers pressed mine, quite affectionately, then released me, and I heard steps passing slowly into the patio, then dying away. Where was it going, and what on earth did it all mean? But I was so tired and wrought up, I tried to find the door, but couldn't. The cashier would have been revenged could he have seen me stupidly fumbling at a barrel thinking it was the door. And at last, too fatigued and sleepy to stand, I dropped down on the cold stone floor and went to sleep. I must have slept for some hours, for when I awoke the light of dawn was coming in at the window, and I sat up and wondered if I had taken leave of my senses during the night. What on earth could I be doing here in the lumber room? Then, like a flash, I remembered, and half unconsciously crept about on the floor, seeking the small ring. There it was. I caught it and jerked at it hard. Hey, presto change! For it seemed to me that the entire floor was giving way. There was a sliding, crashing sound, and I found myself hanging on for dear life to a barrel that, fortunately, retained its equilibrium, and with my feet dangling into space. Down below me was a small, stone-floored room, with big boxes and small ones ranged about the walls. Treasure! Like a flash the thought struck me, and with one leap I was down in the secret room gazing about at the boxes. But alas! Upon investigation, the biggest chests proved empty. The bad, wicked Count! No wonder he couldn't rest in his Spanish grave, but must come back to the scene of his wickedness and deceit to make reparation. but the smaller chests were literally crammed with all sorts of things: big heavy Spanish coins, in gold and silver dinner services, with the crest of the unfortunate emperor, magnificent pieces of jewelled armour and weapons, beautiful jewellery and loose precious stones. I deliberately selected handfuls of the latter, giving my preference to the diamonds and pearls. I had always had a taste for them, which I had never been before able to gratify, and packed them in a wooden box that I found in the lumber room. The gold and dinner services and armour, etc., I left as they were, being rather cumbersome, and carried off, rejoicing, my big box of diamonds and pearls and other jewellery. Needless to say, we didn't go away for the holidays on the 8 o'clock train. But I did come down to the office and proceed to locate my missing 9 cents. After which I unfolded the tale of the ghost and treasure, only keeping quiet the matter of my private loot, of which I was heartily glad afterwards. For when the government learned of the find, what do you suppose they offered me for going about with the ghost and discovering that secret room and treasure? $10,000! When I refused, stating that I would take merely as my reward one of the gold dinner services, the greedy things objected at first, but I finally had my way. And to this very day they have no idea that even I, have all the beautiful jewels. Wouldn't they be furious if they knew it? But they aren't apt to, unless they learn English and read this story, which isn't likely. The Old Mansion. Down on Long Beach, that narrow strip of sand which stretches along the New Jersey coast from Barnegat Inlet to the north to Little Egg Harbor Inlet on the south, the summer sojourner at some one of the numerous resorts, which of late years have sprung up every few miles, may, in wandering over the sand dunes just across the bay from the village of Manahawkin, stumble over some charred timbers or vestiges of crumbling chimneys, showing that once, years back, a human habitation has stood there. If the find rouses the jaded curiosity of the visitor sufficiently to impel him to question the weather-beaten old bayman who sails him on his fishing trips, he will learn that these relics mark the site of one of the first summer hotels erected on the New Jersey coast. That's where the old mansion stood, he will be informed by Captain Nate or Captain Sam, or whatever particular captain it may chance to be, and if by good fortune it chances to be Captain Jim, he will hear a story that will pleasantly pass away the long wait for a sheep's head bite. It was my good luck to have secured Captain Jim for a preceptor in the angler's art during my vacation last summer, and his stories and reminiscences of Long Beach were not the least enjoyable features of the 2 weeks' sojourn. Captain Jim was not garrulous. Few of the baymen are. They are a sturdy, self-reliant, and self-controlled people, full of strong common sense, but still within that firm belief in the supernatural which seems inherent in the dwellers by the sea. The old mansion, said Captain Jim, or the Mansion of Health, for that was its full name, was built way back in 1822, so I've heard my father say. There had been a tavern close by years before, that was kept by a man named Kramer, and people used to come from Philadelphia by stage, 60 miles through the pines, to Hawkin, and then cross here by boat. Some would stop at Kramer's, and others went down to the beach to Homer's, which was clear down at the end of the inlet. Finally some of the wealthy people concluded that they wanted better accommodations than Kramer gave, so they formed the Great Swamp Long Beach Company, and built the Mansion of Health. I've heard that when it was built it was the biggest hotel on the coast, and was considered a wonder. It was 120 feet long, 3 stories high, and had a porch running all the way around it, with a balcony on top. It was certainly a big thing for those days. I've heard father tell many a time of the stage loads of gay people that used to come rattling into Hawkin, each stage drawn by 4 horses, and sometimes 4 or 5 of them a day in the summer. A good many people, too, used to come in their own carriages, and leave them over on the mainland until they were ready to go home. There were gay times at the old mansion then, and it made good times for the people along the shore, too." "How long did the old mansion flourish, Captain?" I asked. "Well, for 25 or 30 years people came there summer after summer. Then they built a railroad to Cape May, and that, with the ghosts, settled the mansion of health." "What do you mean by the ghosts?" I demanded. "Well, you see," said Captain Jim, cutting off a mouthful of navy plug, "the story got around that the old house was haunted. Some people said there were queer things seen there, and strange noises were heard that nobody could account for. And pretty soon the place got a bad name and visitors were so few that it didn't pay to keep it open any more." "But how did it get the name of being haunted, Captain Jim?" I persisted. "Why, it was this way," continued the mariner. "Maybe you've heard of the time early in the 50's, when the Powhatan was wrecked on the beach here, and every soul on board was lost. She was an emigrant ship, and there were over 400 people aboard, passengers and crew. She came ashore here during the equinoctial storm in September. There wasn't any life-saving stations in them days, and everyone was drowned. You can see the long graves now over in the Hawkin churchyard, where the bodies were buried after they came ashore. They put them in 3 long trenches that were dug from one end of the burying ground to the other. The only people on the beach that night was the man who took care of the old mansion. He lived there with his family, and his son-in-law lived with him. He was the wreck master for this part of the coast, too. It wasn't till the second day that people from Hawkin could get over to the beach, and by that time the bodies all had come ashore, and the wreck master had them all piled up on the sand. I was a youngster then, and came over with my father, and I tell you, it was the awfullest sight I ever saw. Them long rows of drowned people, all lying there with their white, still faces turned up to the sky. Some were women with their dead babies clasped tight in their arms, and some were husbands and wives, whose bodies came ashore locked together in a death embrace. I'll never forget that sight as long as I live. Well, when the coroner came and took charge, he began to inquire whether any money or valuables had been found, but the wreck master declared that not a solitary coin had been washed ashore. People thought this was rather singular, as the immigrants were, most of them, well-to-do Germans, and were known to have brought a good deal of money with them, but it was concluded that it had gone down with the ship. Well, the poor immigrants were given pauper burial, and the people had begun to forget their suspicions until 3 or 4 months later there came another storm, and the sea broke clear over the beach, just below the old mansion, and washed away the sand. Next morning early 2 men from Hawkin sailed across the bay and landed on the beach. They walked across on the hard bottom where the sea had washed across, and, when about halfway from the bay, one of the men saw something curious close up against the stump of an old cedar tree. He called the other man's attention to it, and they went over to the stump. What they found was a pile of leather money belts that would have filled a wheelbarrow. Every one was cut open and empty. They had been buried in the sound close by the old stump, and the sea had washed away the covering. The men didn't go any further. They carried the belts to their boats and sailed back to Hawkin as fast as the wind would take them. Of course, it made a big sensation, and everybody was satisfied that the wreck master had robbed the bodies, if he hadn't done anything worse, but there was no way to prove it, and so nothing was done. The wreck master didn't stay around here long after that, though. The people made it too hot for him, and he and his family went away south, where it was said he bought a big plantation and a lot of slaves. Years afterward the story came to Hawkins somehow that he was killed in a barroom brawl, and that his son-in-law was drowned by his boat upsettin' while he was out fishin'. I don't furnish any affidavits with that part of the story, though. However, after that nobody lived in the old mansion for long at a time. People would go there, stay a week or 2, and leave. and at last it was given up entirely to beach parties in the daytime and ghosts at night. "But, Captain, you don't really believe the ghost part, do you?" I asked. Captain Jim looked down the bay, expectorated gravely over the side of the boat, and answered slowly, "Well, I don't know as I would have believed in 'em if I hadn't seen the ghost." "What!" I exclaimed, "you saw it? Tell me about it. I've always wanted to see a ghost, or next best thing, a man who has seen one." "It was one August about 1861," said the captain. "I was a young feller then, and with a half dozen more was over on the beach cutting salt hay. We didn't go home at nights, but did our own cooking in the old mansion kitchen, and at night slept on the piles of hay upstairs. We were a reckless lot of scamps, and reckoned that no ghosts could scare us. There was a big full moon that night, and it was as light as day. The muskeeters was pretty bad too, and it was easier to stay awake than go to sleep. Along toward midnight me and two other fellers went out on the old balcony, and began to race around the house. We hollered and yelled, and chased each other for half an hour or so, and then we concluded we had better go to sleep, so we started for the window of the room where the rest were. This window was near one end on the ocean side, and as I came around the corner, I stopped as if I'd been shot, and my hair raised straight up on the top of my head. Right there in front of that window stood a woman looking out over the sea, and in her arms she held a little child. I saw her as plain as I see you now. It seemed to me like an hour she stood there, but I don't suppose it was a second, then she was gone. When I could move I looked around for the other boys, and they were standing there paralyzed. They had seen the woman too. They didn't say much, and we didn't sleep much that night, and the next night we bunked out on the beach. The rest of the crowd made all manner of fun of us, but we had had all the ghosts we wanted, and I never set foot inside that old house after that." "When did it burn down, Captain?" I asked, as Jim relapsed into silence. "Somewhere about 25 years ago. A beach party had been roasting clams in the old oven, and in some way the fire got to the woodwork. It was as dry as tinder, and I hope the ghosts were all burned up with it." AN UNBIDDEN GUEST. My cousins, Kate and Tom Howard, married at Trinity, at Easter time, concluded to commence housekeeping by taking one of those delightfully expensively furnished unfurnished cottages, with which the fashionable watering place of W abounds, from whose rear windows one might almost take a plunge into the surf, the beach beginning at the back door. They went down quite early in May, being in a great hurry to try their domestic experiment, and as the evenings were still cold, they spent them about the open fire, spooning. It was upon one of those nights, about 11 o'clock, that they were startled by a noise, as of some small object falling, soon followed by the sound of heavy footsteps, and then quiet again reigned supreme. At once, Tom, poker in hand, boldly started in search of the burglar, followed by Kate, wildly clutching at his coat tail, and in a state of tremor. They looked upstairs, under the various beds, Kate suggesting that in novels they were always to be found there. The dining room was next explored, where all seemed well, and lastly the kitchen, where they found what was evidently a solution of the mystery. The burglar had entered by the back door, which was found to be unlocked and slightly ajar. The first excitement subsiding, they returned again to the dining room, where Tom, upon closer inspection, then discovered that one of a pair of quaint little pepper pots, wedding gifts, was missing, and other small articles on the sideboard had been slightly disturbed. The next morning, when Kate mildly remonstrated with the queen of the kitchen for her carelessness, she received a shock by being told that it was her usual custom to leave the door open, so that it would be "aisy, convanient loike for the milkmaid." They parted with her, and a new maid was engaged, whose chief qualification for the place that she was most faithful in the discharge of her duties, especially in locking up. While they mourned the loss of the pepper pot, still it seemed so trifling when they thought of that lovely repoussé salad bowl, sent by Aunt Julia, which stood near by, that nothing was said of the loss outside of the family, and the little household settled into its normal state once more of billing and cooing. About a fortnight later, Tom started out one night with an old fisherman, one of the natives, and a local character, to indulge in that delightful pastime, so dear to the heart of man, known as eeling. And as the night was dark, the eels were particularly sporty, so that it was well on towards the wee sma' hours when Tom at last returned to the cottage. He found all excitement within. Kate was in hysterics, and the new maid, also weeping, was industriously applying the camphor bottle to her mistress's nose. The burglar or ghost, as they had now decided, the windows and doors being found to be securely locked this time, had been abroad again, but had succeeded in purloining nothing. His royal ghostship had amused himself apparently by simply walking about. "Oh, Tom, he had on such heavy boots, and was so dreadfully bold about it," said Kate tearfully. From that time Kate became nervous and refused to be left alone. Tom started whenever a door creaked, and the treasure departed hurriedly, saying, "Faith, the house is haunted, sure." After that Kate spent her days in girl hunting, and her nights in answering shadowy advertisements that never materialized. They tried Irish, English, Dutch, and a heathen Chinee, with a sprinkling of colored ladies to vary the monotony. They seemed about to become famous throughout the length and breadth of the land as the family that changes help once a week, when they landed treasure number 2. Shortly after her advent we were all asked down to W. to help celebrate their happiness, and, incidentally, to christen the new dinner set. We were not a little surprised at finding Kate so pale and Tom rather distrait. However, after a delightful dinner, that should have filled with pleasure the most exacting bride, we adjourned to the piazza, leaving the men to the contemplation of their cigars. We were enthusiastic in our praise of the house, and congratulated Kate in securing such a prize, when to our horror she burst into tears, and said, "Oh, girls, it's a dreadful place. It's haunted," and then tearfully proceeded with the details, until we all felt creepy and suggested the parlor and lights. It was not long afterwards that Kate discovered that Tom had also related the ghost story to the men that evening, to which Ned Harris had said, laconically, "Rats," and Bob Shaw laughingly remarked, "Tom, old chap, you really shouldn't take your nightcap so strong." About the 1st of July the climax came. The ghost walked again, this time taking not only the remaining pepper pot, but also a silver salt cellar. Evidently he had a penchant for small articles, but unlike former times, everything on the sideboard was in the greatest disorder. Aunt Julia's salad bowl was found on the floor, and not far away the cheese dish, with its contents scattered about. This time one of the windows was found half open. A week later a note came to me from Kate, saying that she and Tom had gone to Saratoga to spend the remainder of the season with her mother. The following spring Tom received a note and parcel from Mr. B., the owner of the house at W., which read as follows: "Dear Mr. Howard, I send you by express 3 articles of silver, which my wife suggests may belong to you, as they are marked with your initials, namely, 2 silver pepper pots and a salt cellar. They were found the other day, during the process of spring house cleaning, in a rat hole, behind the sideboard. I forgot to have the hole stopped up last spring, or to caution you against the water rats. The great fellows will get in, you know. Kind regards to Mrs. Howard. Very truly, John B." The next season the Ghost Club was organized, the badge being a small silver rat, bearing proudly aloft a tiny pepper pot. We thoughtfully offered Tom the presidency, but he declined, with offended dignity, from the effects of which I think he will never fully recover. The Dead Woman's Photograph. Virgil Hoyt is a photographer's assistant up at St. Paul, and a man of a good deal of taste. He has been in search of the picturesque all over the West, and hundreds of miles to the north in Canada, and can speak 3 or 4 Indian dialects, and put a canoe through the rapids. That is to say, he is a man of an adventurous sort and no dreamer. He can fight well and shoot well and swim well enough to put up a winning race with the Indian boys, and he can sit all day in the saddle and not dream about it at night. Wherever he goes he uses his camera. The world, Hoyt is in the habit of saying to those who sit with him when he smokes his pipe, was created in 6 days to be photographed. Man, and especially woman, was made for the same purpose. Clouds are not made to give moisture, nor trees to cast shade. They were created for the photographer. In short, Virgil Hoyt's view of the world is whimsical, and he doesn't like to be bothered with anything disagreeable. That is the reason he loathes and detests going to a house of mourning to photograph a corpse. The horribly bad taste of it offends him partly, and partly he is annoyed at having to shoulder, even for a few moments, a part of someone's burden of sorrow. He doesn't like sorrow, and would willingly canoe 500 miles up the cold Canadian rivers to get rid of it. Nevertheless, as assistant photographer, it is often his duty to do this very kind of thing. Not long ago he was sent for by a rich Jewish family at St. Paul to photograph the mother, who had just died. He was very much put out, but he went. He was taken to the front parlor where the dead woman lay in her coffin. It was evident that there was some excitement in the household and that a discussion was going on, but Hoyt wasn't concerned, and so he paid no attention to the matter. The daughter wanted the coffin turned on end, in order that the corpse might face the camera properly, but Hoyt said he could overcome the recumbent attitude and make it appear that the face was taken in the position it would naturally hold in life. And so they went out and left him alone with the dead. The face was a strong and positive one, such as may often be seen among Jewish matrons. Hoyt regarded it with some admiration, thinking to himself that she was a woman who had been used to having her own way. There was a strand of hair out of place. He pushed it back from her brow. A bud lifted its head too high from among the roses on her breast and spoiled the contour of the chin, so he broke it off. He remembered these things later very distinctly, and that his hand touched her bare face 2 or 3 times. Then he took the photographs and left the house. He was very busy at the time, and several days elapsed before he was able to develop the plates. He took them from the bath, in which they had lain with a number of others, and went to work upon them. There were 3 plates. He having taken that number merely as a precaution against any accident. They came up well, but as they developed he became aware of the existence of something in the photograph which had not been apparent to his eye. The mysterious always came under the head of the disagreeable with him, and was therefore to be banished, so he made only a few prints and put the things away out of sight. He hoped that something would intervene to save him from attempting an explanation. But it is a part of the general perplexity of life that things do not intervene as they ought when they ought. So one day his employer asked him what had become of those photographs. He tried to evade him, but it was futile, and he got out the finished photographs and showed them to him. The older man sat staring at them a long time. "Hoyt," said he at length, "you're a young man, and I suppose you have never seen anything like this before. But I have. Not exactly the same thing, but similar phenomena have come my way a number of times since I went into the business, and I want to tell you there are things in heaven and earth not dreamt of." "Oh, I know all that tommy rot," cried Hoyt, angrily, "but when anything happens, I want to know the reason why, and how it is done." "All right," said his employer, "then you might explain why and how the sun rises." But he humored the younger man sufficiently to examine with him the bath in which the plates were submerged, and the plates themselves. All was as it should be, but the mystery was there and could not be done away with. Hoyt hoped against hope that the friends of the dead woman would somehow forget about the photographs, but of course the wish was unreasonable, and one day the daughter appeared and asked to see the photographs of her mother. "Well, to tell the truth," stammered Hoyt, "those didn't come out as well as we could wish." "But let me see them," persisted the lady. "I'd like to look at them, anyway." "Well, now," said Hoyt, trying to be soothing, as he believed it was always best to be with women, to tell the truth, he was an ignoramus where women were concerned, "I think it would be better if you didn't see them. There are reasons why." He ambled on like this, stupid man that he was. And of course the Jewess said she would see those pictures without any further delay. So poor Hoyt brought them out and placed them in her hand, and then ran for the water pitcher, and had to be at the bother of bathing her forehead to keep her from fainting. For what the lady saw was this. Over the face and flowers and the head of the coffin fell a thick veil, the edges of which touched the floor in some places. It covered the features so well that not a hint of them was visible. "There was nothing over mother's face," cried the lady at length. "Not a thing," acquiesced Hoyt. "I know because I had occasion to touch her face just before I took the picture. I put some of her hair back from her brow." "What does it mean, then?" asked the lady. "You know better than I. There's no explanation in science. Perhaps there's some in psychology." "Well," said the lady, stammering a little and coloring, "mother was a good woman, but she always wanted her own way, and she always had it, too." "Yes?" "And she never would have her picture taken. She didn't admire herself. She said no one should ever see a picture of hers." "So?" said Hoyt meditatively. "Well, she's kept her word, hasn't she?" The two stood looking at the pictures for a time. Then Hoyt pointed to the open blaze in the grate. "Throw them in," he commanded. "Don't let your father see them. Don't keep them yourself. They wouldn't be good things to keep." "That's true enough," said the lady slowly. And she threw them in the fire. Then Virgil Hoyt brought out the plates and broke them before her eyes. And that was the end of it, except that Hoyt sometimes tells the story to those who sit beside him when his pipe is lighted. The Ghost of a Live Man. We were in the South Atlantic Ocean, in the latitude of the island of Fernando Noronha, about 40° 12' south, on board the bark H.G. Johnson, homeward bound from Australia. I was the only passenger, and we had safely rounded Cape Horn, with the barometer at 28° 18', and yet had somehow miraculously escaped any extremely heavy gale, had light northerly and easterly winds till we reached 20°, and thence the southeast trades were sending us fast on our way to the equator. I sat on deck smoking my pipe, with a glorious full moon shedding its bright pathway across the blue waters, and chatting with the first mate, a man of some 58 years of age, who had followed the sea since he was a boy. For 20 years or more he had been a mate or captain, and many and varied were the experiences he could relate. A thorough sailor and a skilful navigator, he was as honest as the day is long, had a heart as big as an ox, and was an all-around good fellow and genial companion. Some of his yarns might be taken cum grano salis, yet he always positively assured me that he was telling me the truth. An account of a voyage that he made in a whaler from the Southern Ocean to New Bedford seemed to me worthy to be repeated. He had rounded Cape Horn 6 times and the Cape of Good Hope 26 times, besides making many trips across the Western Ocean and to South American ports. I give his account as near as possible in his own words. It was in '71 that I commanded the whaler Mary Jane. We had been out from home for over 3 years, and had on board a full cargo of whale oil, besides 2,000 pounds of whalebone, which was then worth $5 per pound. I had also been fortunate enough to find in a dead whale which we came across a large quantity of ambergris, and our hearts were all very light as we began our homeward voyage, and our thoughts all tended to the hearty welcome which we should receive from wives and sweethearts when we reached our journey's end. Many a night I lay in my berth I had thought with great pleasure of the amount of money that would be coming to me from the proceeds of our voyage when we arrived in New Bedford. I calculated that I had made $12,000 as my share of the proceeds of the whalebone and oil, to say nothing of the ambergris, which I well knew would bring at least $20,000, and one half of which belonged to me. You can therefore imagine that I was well pleased with myself as we went bounding along through the southeast trades. We crossed the equator in longitude 36, and soon after took strong northeast trades, and all was going well as I could wish. We had put the ship in perfect order, painted her inside and out, and you would never have recognized her as the old whaling ship that had for 3 years been plying the Southern Ocean for whales. Never shall I forget the old bull whale that we tackled about 2 degrees to the south of Cape Horn, but that is another story, which I will give you another time. We had just lost the northeast trades and were entering the Gulf Stream. I sat in my cabin with my chart on the table before me rolled up. I had just picked our location on it, and was thinking that in a week or more I should be at home, surrounded by those near and dear to me, and relating to them the story of my great good fortune. It was always my custom to work up my latitude and longitude about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then after supper pick off her position on the chart, have a smoke, and perhaps just before retiring a nip of grog, and then at 8:30, as regular as a clock, I would turn in. I am a great smoker, and this day I had been smoking all the afternoon, besides having had 2 or 3 nips. We had a dog on board whom we called Boatswain, who had been out with us all the voyage, and who was afraid of nothing. He had endeared himself to every man on board, and when Boatswain took water, something very serious was in the wind. This night as I sat in the cabin I heard a most dismal howl from Boatswain, and called out to the mate to know what was the matter with the dog. He replied that he reckoned some of the men had been teasing him, and the occurrence soon passed from my mind. Suddenly I saw some one coming down the after companionway into the cabin. I supposed at first it was the mate, and wondered that he had not first spoken to me. But then I noticed that he wore clothes I had never seen on the mate, and as he advanced into the cabin I saw his face. It was the face of a man I had never seen in my life. He was thin and pale and haggard, and as he advanced he looked about the cabin and at the rolled-up chart on the table. There seemed to be an appeal in his eyes, and then there swept over his face a look of intense disappointment, and before I could move or speak he had vanished from my sight. Now I am a very practical man, and I at once straightened myself in my chair and said to myself, "Well, old man, you've smoked one too many pipes today, or else you've had one drink too much, for you have been asleep in your chair and seen a ghost." I was quite satisfied that I had had a dream, especially as I called to the mate and asked him if he had seen anyone come below. He said no, that he had not left the deck for the last hour, and the man at the wheel, directly in front of the door, was sure no one had entered the cabin. So I convinced myself that I had had a very vivid dream, though I could not help thinking of the matter all through the next day. At 8 o'clock the next evening I sat in the same place with my work just finished, and the chart rolled up on the table before me, when suddenly the dog's dismal howl rang through the ship, and looking up I saw those same legs coming down the after companion. My hair fairly stood on end, and yet today surely I was wide awake. I had only smoked one pipe all day, and had not touched a drop of liquor. The same wan, emaciated figure walked into the cabin, glanced inquiringly and appealing at me, and again there spread over his face that look of utter disappointment, as if he had sought something and failed to find it, and again he disappeared. I rushed on deck to the mate and told him all I had seen the last 2 nights, but he made light of it, and assured me I had been asleep or smoking too much. He did not like to suggest that I had been drinking. Still, I could see that the thought that came into his mind was, "The old man has seen him again." I gave up trying to convince him, but requested that the next night, from 8 to 8:30, he should sit with me in the cabin. How the next day passed I cannot tell. I only know that my thoughts never left that ghostly visitant, and somehow I felt that the evening would reveal something to me and the spell be broken. I made up my mind I would speak to the thing, whatever it was, and I felt a sort of security in the presence of the mate, who was a daring fellow and feared neither man nor the devil. Neither rum nor tobacco passed my lips during the next day, and 8 o'clock found the mate and I sitting in the cabin, and this time the chart lay open on the table beside us. Just as 8 bells struck the dog's premonitory wail sounded, and looking up we both saw the figure descending the cabin stairs. We both seemed frozen to our seats, and the strange weirdness of the whole proceeding cast the same spell over the mate and me alike, and we were both unable to move or speak. Slowly the figure proceeded into the cabin and glanced around without a word, but with the same expectant look on his face. His form was even more wasted, his cheeks sunken and his eyes seemed almost out of sight, so deeply were they set in their sockets. As his eye fell on the open chart, a look of supreme joy fairly irradiated his features, and advancing to the table he placed one long, bony finger on the chart, held it for a moment and then again disappeared from our sight. For 5 minutes after he had left us we sat speechless. Then I managed to say, "What do you think of that, Mr. Morris?" "My God, sir, I don't know. It's beyond me." Then my eyes fell on the open chart, and there where the finger had been was a tiny spot of blood, exactly on the point of longitude 63° west and latitude 37° north. We were then only about 50 miles distant from that position, and immediately there came to me the determination to steer the ship there, so I laid her course accordingly, and posted a lookout in the crow's nest. At 5 o'clock in the morning, just as the east began to grow grey, the lookout called out, "Boat on the lee bow," and as we came up to it we found 4 men in it, 3 dead and one with just a remnant of life left in him. We sewed the 3 bodies in canvas and buried them in the ocean, and then gave all our attention to restoring life to the poor emaciated frame, which, I then recognised, was the very man who for 3 successive nights had visited me in my cabin. By judicious and careful nursing, life gradually came back to him, and in 4 days' time he was able to sit up and talk with me in the cabin. It seems he commanded the ship Promise, and she had taken fire and been destroyed, and all hands had to take to the boats. 10 were in the boats at first, but their food had given out, and one by one he had seen them die, and one by one he had cast the bodies overboard. Finally he lost consciousness and knew not whether his 3 remaining companions were dead or alive. Then he said he seemed in a dream to see a ship and tried to go to her for help, but just as he would be going on board of her, something would seem to keep him back. 3 times in his dreams he tried to visit this ship, and the last time there seemed to come to him a certain satisfaction, and he felt that he had succeeded in his object. Turning to my table he said, "Let me take your chart, I'll show you just where we were." "Stop," said I, "don't take that chart. It is an old one and all marked over. Mark your position on this new one." He took my pencil and knife, and carefully sharpened his pencil. Then, taking my dividers, he measured his latitude and longitude and placed a pencil dot at a point on the clean chart. As he lifted his hand he said, "Oh, excuse me, Captain, I cut my finger in sharpening the pencil and left a drop of blood on the chart." "Never mind," said I, "leave it there." And then I produced the old chart, and there, in an exactly corresponding place, was the drop of blood left by my ghostly visitor. Then looking steadily into my face, the mate solemnly added, "I can't explain this, sir, perhaps you can, but I can tell you on my honour it's God's own truth that I have told you." The Ghost of Washington. It was early on Christmas morning when John Riley wheeled away from a picturesque little village where he had passed the previous night, to continue his cycling tour through eastern Pennsylvania. Today his intention was to stop at Valley Forge, and then to ride up the Schuylkill Valley, visiting in turn the many points of historical interest that lay along his route. Valley Forge, his road map indicated, was but a short distance further on. All round him were the hills and fields and roads over which Washington and his half-starved army had forged and roamed throughout the trying winter of 1777–78, 126 years ago. It was a beautiful Christmas day, truly, and as he wheeled along, young Riley's thoughts were almost equally divided between the surrounding pleasant scenery and the folks at home, who, he knew very well, were assembling at just about the present time round a heavily laden Christmas tree in the front parlor. The sun rose higher and higher, and Riley pedalled on down the valley, passing every now and then quaint, pleasant-looking farmhouses, many of which, no doubt, had been built anterior to the period which had given the vicinity its history. Arriving finally at a place where the road forked off in two directions, Riley was puzzled which way to go on. There happened to be a dwelling close by. Accordingly he dismounted, left his wheel leaning against a gate-post at the side of the road, and walked up a wretchedly flagged walk leading to the house, with the idea of getting instructions from its inmates. Situated in the centre of an unkept field of rank grass and weeds, the building lay back from the highway probably 150 feet. It was long and low in shape, containing but one story, and having what is termed a gabled roof, under which there must have been an attic of no mean size. On coming close to the house, a fact Riley had not noticed from the road became plainly evident. It was deserted. He saw that the roof and side shingles were in wretched condition, that the window sashes and frames as well as the doors and door frames were missing from the openings in the side walls where once they had been, and that the entire side of the house, including that part of the stone foundation which showed above the ground, was full of cracks and seams. At first, on the point of turning back, he concluded to see what the interior was like anyway. Accordingly he went inside. Glancing around the large dust-filled room he had entered, his gaze at first failed to locate any object of the least interest. A rickety-appearing set of steps went up into the attic from one side of the apartment, and over in one corner was a large open fireplace, from the walls of which much of the brickwork had become loosened and fallen out. Riley had started up the steps toward the attic, when, happening to look back for an instant, his attention was attracted to a singular-looking, jug-shaped bottle no larger than a vinegar cruet, which lay upon its side on the hearth of the fireplace, partly covered up by debris of loose bricks and mortar. He hastened back down the steps and crossed the room, taking the bottle up in his hand and examining it with curiosity. Being partly filled with a liquid of some kind or other, the bottle was very soon uncorked and held under the young man's nose. The liquid gave forth a peculiar, pungent, and inviting odor. Without further hesitation Riley's lips sought the neck of the bottle. It is hardly possible to describe the pleasure and satisfaction his senses experienced as he drank. While the liquid was still gurgling down his throat, a heavy hand was placed most suddenly on his shoulder, and his body was given a violent shaking. The bottle fell to the floor and was broken into 100 pieces. "Hullo," said a rough voice almost in Riley's ear. "Who are you, anyway, and what are you doing within the lines? A spy, I'll be bound." As most assuredly there had been no one else in the vicinity of the building when he had entered it, and with equal certainty no one had come down the steps from the attic, Riley was naturally surprised and mystified by this unexpected assault. He struggled instinctively to break loose from the unfriendly grasp, and when he finally succeeded, he twisted his body around so that he faced across the room. Immediately he made the remarkable discovery that there were 4 other persons in the apartment, Three uncouth-looking fellows habited in fantastic but ragged garments, and a matronly-looking woman, the latter standing over a wash-tub which had been elevated upon two chairs in a corner near the fireplace. To all appearance, the woman had been busy at her work, and had stopped for the moment to see what the men were going to do. Her waist sleeves were rolled up to the shoulders, and her arms dripped with water and soap suds. Over the tops of the tubs, partly filled with water, there were visible the edges of several well-soaked fabrics. To add to his astonishment he noticed that in the chimney place, which a moment before was falling apart, but now seemed to be clean and in good condition, a cheerful fire burned, and that above the flames was suspended an iron pot, from which issued a jet of steam. He also noticed that the entire appearance of the room had undergone a great change. Everything seemed to be in good repair, tidy and neat: the ceilings, the walls, and the door, even the stairway leading to the attic. The openings in the walls were fitted with window sashes and well-painted doors. The apartment had, in fact, evolved under his very eyesight from a state of absolute ruin into one of excellent preservation. All of this seemed so weird and uncanny, that Riley stood for a moment or two in the transformed apartment, utterly dumbfounded, with his mouth wide open and his eyes all but popping out of his head. He was brought to his senses by the fellow who had shaken him growlingly out. "Come, explain yourself." "An explanation is due me," Riley managed to gasp. "Don't bandy words with the rascal, Harry," one of the other men spoke up. "Bring him along to headquarters." Thereupon, without further parley, the three men marched Riley in military fashion into the open air and down to the road. Here he picked up at the gate post his bicycle, while they unstacked a group of three old-fashioned looking muskets located close by. When the young man had entered the house a few minutes before, this stack of arms had not been there. He could not understand it. Neither could he understand, on looking back at the building as he was marched off down the road, the mysterious agency that had transformed its dilapidated exterior, just as it had been the interior, into a practically new condition. While they trudged along, the strangers exhibited a singular interest in the wheel Riley pushed at his side, running their coarse hands over the frame and handle bar, and acting on the whole as though they never before had seen a bicycle. This in itself was another surprise. He had hardly supposed there were three men in the country so totally unacquainted with what is a most familiar piece of mechanism everywhere. At the same time that they were paying so much attention to the wheel, Riley in turn was studying with great curiosity his singular-looking captors. Rough, unprepossessing appearing fellows they were, large of frame and unshaven, and it must be added, dirty of face. What remained of their very ragged clothing, he had already noticed, was of a most remarkable cut and design, resembling closely the garments worn by the Continental militiamen in the War of Independence. The hats were broad, low of crown, and three-cornered in shape. The trousers were buff-colored and extended at the knees, and the long, blue spike-tailed coats were flapped over at the extremities of the tails, the flaps being fastened down with good-sized brass buttons. Leather leggings were strapped around cowhide boots, through the badly worn feet of which, in places where the leather had cracked open, the flesh unprotected by stockings could be seen. Dressed as he was, in a cleanly, gray cycling costume, Riley's appearance, most assuredly, was strongly in contrast to that of his companions. After a brisk walk of 20 minutes, during which they occasionally met and passed by one or two or perhaps a group of men clothed and outfitted like Riley's escorts, the little party followed the road up a slight incline and around a well-wooded bend to the left, coming quite suddenly, and to the very captive, very unexpectedly, to what was without a doubt a military encampment. A village, in fact, composed of many rows of small log huts. Along the streets, between the buildings, muskets were stacked in hundreds of places. Over in one corner, on a slight eminence commanding the road up which they had come, and cleverly hidden from it behind trees and shrubbery, the young man noticed a battery of field pieces. Wherever the eye was turned on this singular scene were countless numbers of soldiers all garmented in three-cornered hats, spike-tailed coats, and knee breeches, walking lazily hither and thither, grouped around crackling fires, or parading up and down the streets in platoons under the guidance of ragged but stern-looking officers. Harry stopped the little procession of four in front of one of the larger of the log houses. Then, while they stood there, the long blast from a bugle was heard, followed by the roll of drums. A minute or two afterward, several companies of militia marched up and grounded their arms, forming three sides of a hollow square around them, the fourth and open side being toward the log house. Directly succeeding this maneuver there came through the doorway of the house and stepped up the center of the square, stopping directly in front of Riley, a dignified-looking person, tall and straight and splendidly proportioned of figure, and having a face of great nobility and character. The cold chills chased one another down Riley's back. His limbs swayed and tottered beneath his weight. He had never experienced another such sensation of mingled astonishment and fright. He was in the presence of General Washington, not a phantom Washington either, but Washington in the flesh and blood, as material and earthly as a being as ever crossed a person's line of vision. Riley, in his time, had seen so many portraits, marble busts and statues of the great commander, that he could not be mistaken. Recovering the use of his faculties, which for the moment he seemed to have lost, Riley did the very commonplace thing that others before him have done when placed unexpectedly in remarkable situations. He pinched himself to make sure that he was in reality wide awake and in the natural possession of his senses. He felt like pinching the figure in front of him also, but he could not muster up the courage to do that. He stood there trying to think it all out, and as his thoughts became less stagnant, his fright dissolved under the process of reasoning his mind pursued. To reason a thing out, even though an explanation can only be obtained by leaving much of the subject unaccounted for, tends to make one bolder and less shaky in the knees. The series of strange incidents which he was experiencing had been inaugurated in the old-fashioned dwelling he had visited after information concerning the roads, and everything had been going along in a perfectly normal way up to the very moment when he had taken a drink from the bottle found in the fireplace. But from that precise time everything had gone wrongly. Hence the inference that the drinking of the peculiar liquid was accountable in some way or other for his troubles. There was a supernatural agency in the whole thing. That much must be admitted. And whatever that agency was, and however it might be accounted for, it had taken Riley back into a period of time more than 100 years ago, and landed him, body and soul, within the lines of the patriotic forces wintering at Valley Forge. He might have stood there, turning over and over in his mind, pinching himself and muttering, all the morning, had not the newcomer ceased a silent but curious inspection of his person, and asked, "Who are you, sir?" "John Riley, at your pleasure," the young man replied, adding a question on his own account, "And who are you, sir?" Immediately he received a heavy thump on his back from Harry's hard fist. "It is not for you to question the general," the ragged administrator of the blow exclaimed. "And it is not for you to be so gay," Riley returned angrily, giving the blow back with added force. "Here, here," broke in the first questioner. "Fisticuffs under my very nose. No more of this. I command you both." To Harry he added an extra caution. "Your zeal in my behalf will be better appreciated by being less demonstrative. Blows should be struck only on the battlefield." To Riley he said, with a slight smile hovering over his face, "My name is Washington. Perhaps you may have heard of me." To this Riley replied, "I have indeed, and heard you very well spoken of, too." Emboldened by the other's smile, he ventured another question. I think my reckoning of the day and year is badly at fault. An hour ago I thought the day was Christmas Day. How far out of the way did my calculation take me, sir? The day is indeed Christmas Day, and the year is, as you must know, the year of our Lord 1777. Riley again pinched himself. "Why do you bring this man to me?" Washington now inquired, turning to Harry and his companions. "He is a spy, sir," said Harry. "That is a lie," Riley indignantly interpolated. "I have done nothing to warrant any such charge. We found him in the widow Robin's house, pouring strong liquor down his throat. I had gone inside after information concerning the roads." "Which he was getting from a bottle, sir." "If drinking from a bottle of necessity constitutes being a spy, I fear our camp is already a hotbed," Washington somewhat sagely remarked, casting his eye around slyly at his officers and men. "Tell me," he went on, with sudden sternness, looking Riley through and through, as though to read his very thoughts, "is the charge true? Do you come from Howe?" "The charge is not true, sir. I come from no one. I'm simply making a tour of pleasure through this part of the country on my bicycle." With the country swarming with the men from two hostile armies, any kind of tour, save one of absolute necessity, seems ill timed. "When I set out I knew nothing about any armies. The fact is, sir," Riley started to make an explanation, but he checked himself on realizing that the telling of any such improbable yarn would only increase the hazardousness of his position. "Well?" Washington questioned in a tone of growing suspicion. "I certainly did not know that your army or any other army was quartered in this vicinity." Riley hesitated for lack of something further to say. "You see," he finally added, prompted by a happy idea, "I rode my wheel from New York." "You may have come from New York, though it is hard to believe you came on that singular looking machine so great a distance. Where is the horse which drew the vehicle?" Riley touched his bicycle. "This is the horse, sir, just as it is the vehicle," he said. "The man is crazy!" Harry exclaimed. Washington only looked the incredulity he felt, and this time asked a double question. "How can the thing be balanced without its being held upright by a pair of shafts from a horse's back, and how is the motive power acquired?" For an answer Riley jumped upon the wheel, and at a considerable speed and in a haphazard way pedalled around the place within the hollow square of soldiers. Hither and thither he went, at one second nearly wheeling over the toes of the line of astonished, if not frightened, militiamen, at the next bearing suddenly down on Harry and his companions, and making them dance and jump almost alertly to avoid a collision. Even the dignified Washington was once or twice put to the necessity of dodging hurriedly aside when his equilibrium was threatened. Riley eventually dismounted, doing so with assumed clumsiness by stopping the wheel at Harry's back and falling over heavily against the soldier. Harry tumbled to the ground, but Riley dexterously landed on his feet. At once he began offering a profusion of apologies. "You did that by design!" Harry shouted, jumping to his feet. His face was red with anger, and he shook his fist threateningly at the bicyclist. Washington commanded the man to hold his peace. Then to Riley he expressed a great surprise at his performance, and a desire to know more about the bicycle. The young man thereupon described the machine minutely, lifting it into the air and spinning the wheels to illustrate how smoothly they rotated. "I can see it is possible to ride the contrivance with rapidity. It has been put together with wonderful ingenuity," Washington said, when Riley had replaced the wheel on the ground. "And you, sir?" "It is but a toy," an officer spoke up. "Put our friend on this bundle of tin and race him against one of our horsemen, and he would make a sorry showing." Riley smiled. "I bear the gentleman no ill will for his opinion," he said. "Still, I would like to show him by a practical test of the subject that his ignorance of it is most profound." "You would test the speed of the machine against that of a horse?" Washington said in amazement. "I would, sir. You have a good road yonder. With your permission and a worthy opponent I would make the test at once." "But, sir, the man is a spy," Harry broke in. "Would it not be better to throw a rope around his neck and give him his deserts?" "The charge is by no means proven," Washington replied, "nor can it be until a court martial convenes this afternoon. And I see no reason why we may not in the meantime enjoy the unique contest which has been suggested. It will make a pleasant break in the routine of camp life." A murmur of approval went up from the masses of men by whom they were surrounded. While they had been talking, it seemed as though everybody in the camp not already on the scene had gathered together behind the square of infantry. "Then, sir," Harry said, with some eagerness, "I would like to be the man to ride the horse. There is no better animal than mine anywhere, and I understand his tricks and humours quite well enough to put him to his best pace." "I confess I have heard you well spoken of as a horseman," Washington said. "Be away with you. Saddle and bridle your horse at once." It was the chain of singular circumstances narrated above which brought John Riley into the most remarkable contest of his life. He had entered many bicycle races at one time or another, always with credit to himself and to the club whose colours he wore, and he had every expectation of making a good showing today. Yet a reflection of the weird conditions which had brought about the present contest took away some of his self-possession when a few minutes later he was marched over to the turnpike and left to his own thoughts, while the officers were pacing out a 1-mile straightaway course down the road. After the measurement had been taken, 2 unbroken lines of soldiers were formed along the entire mile, a most evident precaution against Riley leaving the race course at any point to escape across the fields. Washington came up to him again, when the preparations were completed, to shake his hand and whisper a word or two of encouragement in his ear. Having performed these kindly acts, he left to take up a position near the point of finish. The beginning of the course was located close to the battery of half-concealed field pieces. Riley was now conducted to this place. Shortly afterward Harry appeared on his horse. He leered at the bicyclist contemptuously and said something of a sarcastic nature, partly under his breath when the two lined up, side by side, for the start. To these slights Riley paid no heed. He had a strong belief that when the race was over there would be left in the mutton-like head of his opponent very little of his present inclination toward the humorous. The soldier's mount was a handsome black mare, 14½ hands high, strong of limbs and at the flanks, and animated by a spirit that kept her prancing around with continuous action. It must be admitted that the man rode very well. He guided the animal with ease and nonchalance when she reared and plunged, and kept her movements confined to an incredibly small piece of ground, considering her abundance of action. "Keep to your own side of the road throughout the race. I don't want to be collided with by your big beast," Riley cautioned while they were awaiting 2 signals from the starter. To this Harry replied in some derision, "I'll give you a good share of the road at the start, and all of it by my dust, too, afterward." And then the officer who held the pistol fired the first shot. Riley was well satisfied with the conditions under which the race was to be made. The road was wide and level, smooth, hard and straight, and a strong breeze which had sprung up blew squarely against his back. His wheel was geared up to 84 inches. The breeze promised to be a valuable adjunct in pushing it along. Awaiting the second and last signal, Riley glanced down the 2 blue ranks of soldiers, which stretched away into lazy lines in the distance and converged at the termination of the course, where a flag had been stuck into the ground. The soldiers were at parade rest. Their unceasing movements as they chatted to one another, turning their bodies this way and that and craning their heads forward to look toward the starting point, and then jerking them back, made the lines seem like long, squirming snakes. At the end of the course a thick bunch of military men clogged the road and overspread into the fields. Crack! The signal to be off. Riley shoved aside the fellow who had been holding his wheel upright while astride of it, and pushed down on the pedals. The mare's hoofs dug the earth, her great muscular legs straightened out, she sprang forward with a snort of apparent pleasure, taking the lead at the very start. Riley heard the shout of excitement run along the two ranks of soldiers. He saw them waving their arms and hats as he went by. And on ahead through the cloud of dust there was visible the shadow-like outlines of the snorting, galloping horse, whose hoof beats sounded clear and sharp above the din which came from the sides of the highway. The mare crept farther and farther ahead. Very soon 100 feet or more of the road lay between her and the bicyclist. Harry turned in his saddle and called out another sarcasm. "I shall pass you very soon. Keep to your side of the road," Riley shouted, not a bit daunted by the way the race had commenced. His head was well down over the handlebars, his back had the shape of the upper portion of an immense egg. Up and down his legs moved, faster and faster and faster yet. He went by the soldiers so rapidly that they only appeared by two streaks of blurry color. Their sharp rasping shouts sounded like cracking of musketry. The cloud of dust blew against the cyclist's head and into his mouth and throat. When he glanced ahead again he saw with satisfaction that the mare was no longer increasing her lead. It soon became evident even that he was slowly cutting down the advantages she had secured. Harry again turned his head shortly afterward, doubtless expecting to find his opponent hopelessly distanced by this time. Instead of this, Riley was alarmingly close upon him. The man ejaculated a sudden oath and lashed his animal furiously. Straining every nerve and sinew, the mare for the moment pushed further ahead. Then her pace slackened a bit, and Riley again crept up to her. Closer and closer to her than before, until his head was abreast of her outstretched tail. Harry was lashing the mare and swearing at her unceasingly now. But she had spurted once and appeared to be incapable of again increasing her speed. In this way she went on for some little distance, Harry using his whip brutally, the mare desperately struggling to attain a greater pace. Riley hanging on with tenacity to her hind flanks and giving up not an inch of ground. A mile is indeed a very short distance when traversed at such a pace. The finishing flag was already but a few 100 feet farther on. Riley realized that it was time now to go to the front. He gritted his teeth together with determination and bent his head down even further toward his front wheel. Then his feet began to move so quickly that there was only visible an indistinct blur at the sides of his crankshaft. At this very second, with a face marked with rage and hatred, Harry brought his horse suddenly across the road to that part of it which he had been warned to avoid. It is hard to tell what kept Riley from being run into and trampled underfoot. An attempt at backpedaling, a sudden twist of the handlebar, a lurch to one side that almost threw him from his seat. Then, in the fraction of a second he was over on the other side of the road, pushing ahead of the mare, almost as though she were standing still. The outburst of alarm from the throats of the soldiers changed when they saw that Riley had not been injured. First into a shout of indignation at the dastardly attempt which had been made to run him down, and then into a roar of delight when the bicyclist breasted the flag, a winner of the race by 20 feet. As he crossed the line Riley caught a glimpse of Washington. He stood close to the flag and was waving his hat in the air with enthusiasm of a schoolboy. Riley went down the road, slackening his speed as effectively as he could. But before it was possible to entirely stop his wheel's momentum, the noisy acclamations in his rear ceased with startling suddenness. He turned in his saddle and looked back. As sure as St. Peter, he had the road entirely to himself. There wasn't a soldier or a ghost of a soldier in sight. As soon as he could he turned his bicycle about and rode back along the highway, now so singularly deserted, looking hither and thither in vain for some trace of the vanished army. Even the flag which had been stuck into the ground at the end of the 1-mile race course was gone. The breeze had died out again, and the air was tranquil and warm. In the branches of a near-by tree two sparrows chirped and twittered peacefully. Riley went back to the place where the camp had been. He found there only open fields on one side of the road and a clump of woodland on the other. He continued on down the little hill up which Harry and his companions had brought him a few hours previously, and followed the road on further, coming finally to the fork in it near which was located the old farmhouse, wherein he had been taken captive. The house was, as it had been when he had previously entered it, falling apart from age and neglect. When he went inside, he found lying on the brick hearth in front of the fireplace a number of pieces of broken glass.